Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with Phil Rosenzweig, who is the author of One Splendid Season, Baseball in America in 1912, told with the words and images of the Hassan Triplefolder set. Phil's book is one of the 10 finalists for the 2025 Casey Award, which is an annual literary award that has been given to the best baseball book of the year since 1983 and is considered to be the most prestigious award that can be given to a baseball book. In 1912, the American Tobacco Company designed an innovative set that combined the end panels from the 1911 T205 set, but with white borders instead of gold, and a center panel consisting of a black and white photograph. The center panels are the first examples of fast shutter photography on baseball cards ever. One Splendid Season tells the story of the 1912 baseball season through the words and images of the Hassan Triplefolder tobacco card set. It offers a rich portrait of baseball and its place in American society in the deadball era, with photographs, postcards, and other memorabilia. Every panel from the T202 set is presented in the book with a high-resolution scan, in vibrant color and outstanding detail, and in its actual size. The author of this incredible book, Phil Rosenzweig, was born and raised in Northern California. He is Professor Emeritus of Business Administration at the International Institute for Management Development in Lausanne, Switzerland, and is the author of numerous other books which have been translated into 14 languages. For over 35 years now, Phil has been active as a teacher, researcher, and writer. He received his PhD from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in 1990. From 1990 to 1996, Phil was assistant professor at Harvard Business School in Boston. Then from 1996 to 2021, Phil was a professor at IMD in Switzerland, which is one of the world's leading business schools. While he was at IMD, Phil directed programs with many leading companies and led the EMBA for 6 years. Prior to his career in academia, Phil got his BA in economics from UC Santa Barbara, an MBA from UCLA, and worked with Hewlett-Packard in California. Today, Phil lives in the United Kingdom, which made scheduling this interview kind of tricky. Phil and I met on April 15th, 2024 at Gitterman Gallery in New York City for the grand opening of Paul Referson's incredible exhibition, Jackie Robinson and the Color Line. Jackie Robinson and the Color Line was an exhibition of the collection of Paul Referson, which used photographs and artifacts to vividly narrate the story of baseball's journey toward integration. The exhibition framed Robinson's odyssey within a larger one that had begun 60 years earlier, when men like Fleet and Weldy Walker, Sol White, Robert Higgins, and Javon Emery played for integrated teams in the late 19th century. The exhibition of photographs, complemented by historic artifacts, illuminated the pervasive racism and the fervent aspirations for integration during that era. The reason I remember the exact date that Phil and I met is because every year, Major League Baseball recognizes and celebrates April 15th as Jackie Robinson Day, since Jackie officially broke Major League Baseball's color barrier on April 15th, 1947. And since Jackie was the central figure in Paul Referson's exhibition, that's why he chose April 15th as the date of its grand opening. To the best of my knowledge, the crowd of people in the room that day is now officially the largest gathering of My Baseball History guests ever assembled in one place, with myself, Greg Kreinler, William Peebles, Paul Referson, and Phil Rosenzweig all in attendance. Phil's love of photography was evident that day, as was his love of baseball and history, so naturally we hit it off. When Phil got back to the UK, he sent me a copy of the paperback version of his book, which I fell in love with. I asked if he would be down to come on the podcast, with the caveat being that we would have to record the interview in person. He said yes, but then it took about a year for our schedules to line up. Thankfully, in August of 2025, Phil gave me the heads up that he would be back on my side of the pond in October, so I planned a trip to meet him in Rhode Island so we could finally sit down for our interview. We were right on the Atlantic and spent a great day together. We recorded our interview in the afternoon, then we had dinner, and then we came back and watched some playoff baseball. It couldn't have been a better day. The conversation you're about to listen to between Phil and I is actually structured a lot like his book, One Splendid Season. We used the T202 Hassan Triplefolder's baseball card set to tell the story of the 1912 season in Major League Baseball, while thoroughly dissecting the T202 set itself. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Phil tells us who the photographers were of the different images in the groundbreaking card set, and who some of the subjects of those photographs were, including superstars like Ty Cobb, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson, Tris Speaker, Napoleon Lajoie, and even Shoeless Joe Jackson. We find out how the American Tobacco Company relied on Spalding's official baseball guide, which was an annual guide founded by A.G. Spalding and published by his American Sports Publishing Company, for much of the content which made up the T202 set. We learn the identity of the mysterious baseball field, which was the site where a number of photos appearing in the set were taken. And we hear all about the 1912 season, from the opening day clash between the New York Giants and Brooklyn Dodgers, to the dramatic 4th of July contest between the Philadelphia Athletics and Boston Red Sox, and finally ending with the epic 1912 World Series, which was won in 8 games by the Red Sox over the Giants, and is one of the first truly great World Series in history. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. If you're new to the show, don't worry. You'll still be able to enjoy this episode without the extra help from the liner notes. But longtime listeners love the photos and links we put up on the website, which will give you a better understanding of the things Phil and I are discussing, and provide some context when needed. The liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Phil Rosenzweig episode listed first on the main page under Latest Episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our earlier interviews, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of our 4 previous seasons and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened. I'll also explain how you'll have a couple chances to answer a trivia question to win a prize, so stick around until the end of the episode for that too. But now, here's my interview with author Phil Rosenzweig. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and going to Candlestick Park.
I'm a native of the East Bay. I was born in Oakland but raised in Berkeley, and that means that our local team was the San Francisco Giants. I became a big Giants fan in 1962 when I was in the 2nd grade. And the first game I went to was, I think, the day after school ended that June. There was a boy in the class who had a birthday, and his mom took about a half dozen of us to Candlestick Park to see the Giants against the Cardinals. And that was my first time at a major league stadium. The enormous expanse, the large structure, and seeing your team out there in their white uniforms. So that was a very memorable day.
Were you already a baseball fan before then, or were you invested enough to have your heart broken in the 1962 World Series? Or was that not something that really affected you yet because you didn't quite understand that that's not something that normally happens to a team?
Boy, there's a lot in that question, Dan. So if we go back, I remember my dad bought my first pack of baseball cards at the local variety store when I was 5 years old. And we opened it up and he said, you know, there's this game of baseball and some people throw the ball and some people swing a bat. And I still have those cards. But he was not a baseball fan and was really not very knowledgeable about baseball. I have a dim recollection of the 61 season and Roger Maris going after the record of 61 home runs. But it was in the 2nd grade then, in spring of 1962, when it seemed like all the boys in class were wild about baseball. And so I became a Giants fan then. Mm-hmm. I went to that Cardinals game in June. I went to a Dodger game in August that was a very memorable game. I do remember that pennant race in 62. Curiously, I have a pretty good memory. I have no recollection of the 1962 World Series, although I know I must have been following it.
Yeah.
It was the same month as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I don't know if there's any relation there, but I think I have pretty much a continuous memory of historical events from 1963 onward, and the last recorded gap in my memory is October 1962. So I do not remember
Have
the
you
62
talked to a
World
therapist
Series.
about that?
That's probably one of the. That's somewhere down the list of things I should talk to a therapist about. There's probably many more, but I do remember the 3-game playoff against the Dodgers. It went to the third game, and that afternoon, of course, they were all day games.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't played at night. I had an afternoon, kind of an organized sandlot game that some of my pals in class and I went to. This is now the beginning of third grade. And so I had to come home to hear that the Giants had prevailed. So I was aware of that, and I'm sure I was following the World Series in some way,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't remember it. No, so my heart was not really broken. I remember collecting Topps cards the next spring, and there were World Series cards, and I remember collecting them, and when I had all 7 games saying, oh, isn't this interesting? The Yankees won all the odd games, and the Giants won the even games, but they lost Game 7. So I learned about it only the following spring.
Tell me a little bit about how you started collecting cards. You said the 1960 top set was kind of the first one that you got into, and then from 63 to 68, you were like officially on board.
Right. And in third grade, I think every boy in my class, except for the few who were interested in, Dracula and Frankenstein and didn't care about baseball, we all collected.
Mm-hmm.
So I loved the 63 set, and then on after that, collected pretty steadily through 1968. I had a friend in 1967. I remember him saying, I'm not going to pay 5 cents and buy these packs of cards at the store. I'm going to send $14.95 off to buy the entire set. Well, I didn't have $14.95, but if my friend Dick was able to do it, so I cajoled my dad to write a check, and then he deducted it from my allowance, 25 cents a week for however many weeks. And so I still have that entire set.
Cool. One
One reason that happened, and I think this is important, I grew up in California, and the first set from Topps would appear sometime in March during spring training, and then the second set and the third set, and it was a big deal when the next set would come out. And then sometime around June, around the time school got out, you'd go to the store and, well, they still had the same set. They didn't have the next set. We thought in California that's because the cards were somewhere on a Pioneer wagon train somewhere in Nebraska, and they just kind of never got to the coast. I now think it's probably because the retailers would order a bunch, and if they didn't sell their stock, they just wouldn't order the next. But the implication was that if you were collecting top sets, at least where I lived, you almost never got the last 2 series.
Interesting.
And so even if you were spending all of your allowance money, you were never going to complete the set. And so you'd get to the end of the year and you'd say, but I don't have McCovey and I don't have Cepeda, and how do I get them? And then you would find an ad for one of these retailers, these card retailers, and you would send a few cents off and wait until the post would come, and you would then complete your team, the team that you cared about, but you would never really complete the set. So when I could buy the entire set in one fell swoop, that was very attractive. And I continued that until I was about 13.
Yeah, $14.95 well spent. When did you see your first vintage baseball card?
So, of course, that begs the question, what is vintage? Because today people think the 60s was vintage, but in 1968 or in 69, that was not vintage.
I'd say anything pre-war.
Right. So let me make another little distinction. I had some friends in the neighborhood that had some cards from the 50s. And when you saw a 56 Topps, that wasn't even a photograph. It was sort of a painting. Or, for heaven's sakes, you saw a 57 New York Giants, my gosh. When you grew up with the San Francisco Giants and you thought, well, that was the normal state of the world, the fact that there's this New York team, that felt vintage.
Yeah.
So to be able to collect even Topps cards and Bowman cards from the 50s had a certain thrill to it. But I think it was probably around 1969 when I became aware of vintage cards. There were a few publications, and I actually had a neighbor with a very extensive tobacco card collection.
Cool.
And so I saw what was there. The problem, of course, is your eyes are a lot bigger than your pocketbook because you're 14 years old and you don't have any money.
And you're paying your dad 25 cents a week to pay off the full set.
Exactly. That took a while, but he indulged me on that. So I was able to see some vintage cards and begin also to collect some, although, of course, with very modest aspirations at the time.
And when you did see your first tobacco card, was it something that you were immediately like, oh, I need to know everything about these and collect as many as I can? Or did it take a while for you to kind of revisit them and be like, what was that? Because they look different than the cards that you were used to. So, like, did you even kind of consciously understand that it was a baseball card?
Oh, sure. And I understood that now they came with gum, and in other times they came with caramels, or they were in cigarettes. Sure, I mean, you get that. I never looked at them and said, I must have these. I must be a big collector. I need to collect as many as possible. I was interested in my team, which was the Giants. And fortunately, the Giants, in the dead ball era, you had some great players and managers and so forth. And I was able to acquire, for not very much money, an assortment of T206, T205s. I don't remember how I got them. I think I must have just sent a few dollars to somebody who sent me a stack. And you would get a few dozen of your favorite team. A lot of them were beat up. Some had creases. A lot of them were scuffed. But some were in terrific condition. Many you would want to upgrade, but others are real keepers, and to this day are keepers. Yeah. So that was my first acquaintance with T206, T205, and then the T202s.
The T202 set, the cards themselves are about 2¼ inches by 5¼ inches. Each card is designed with 2 full-color end panels, which is kind of similar to appearance to a regular T205 card, and those bookended a black and white center panel picture. The center panel bears an action photo or a portrait. Tobacco cards are generally small because of the packaging that they came in. What kind of packaging were the T202s coming in, which allowed them to be so much bigger than a T206 or a T205?
Well, they're not hugely bigger. They're twice as big. When you unfold them, they're 4 times as wide, but the 2 end panels fold over the center panel, and so they're essentially twice as big. And they were in a pack of cigarettes that was a little bit bigger, but it wasn't huge. I don't know where the idea came from to go from just a single panel to 3 panels that folded over, but I can tell you the first time I saw them, I was really struck by them, and I was struck not just by the end panels, which are as beautiful as the T205s, although they don't have the gold border, they just have a white border, but I was really struck by these center panels that have, to my knowledge, the first fast shutter speed photographs on any baseball cards.
Yeah, I believe this is possibly the first example of a card set using a fast shutter speed, with shutter speeds up to 1/1000th of a second. And while cameras did have fast shutter speeds in those days, this was before a time when photographers had telephoto lenses. So for the people taking the action photos, which appeared as the center panels of these cards, where would they have had to have been positioned within the stadium to get these images?
So the great majority of them that were taken during games were taken by photographers kneeling either very close to the first baseman or very close to the third baseman. There are a few that are taken near home plate, occasionally of a batter, although that could be quite dangerous, more often of a play at the plate, in which case I think one of the photographers, seeing that a play at the plate was about to happen, would have dashed over to home plate, set his camera down, and taken the shot. But the great majority are either right next to first base or right next to third. And so the kinds of things that you see over and over, a first baseman guarding first with a runner, getting a pickoff play, or just holding the runner on, or a runner coming down first base and maybe passing the bag. At third base, lots of plays at third base, runners sliding into third base, sometimes runners passing third base on the way to home plate. So those are the main things that you will see. What you never see, because there were no telephoto lenses there, you will never see an outfielder making a great play in the outfield. You won't see a shortstop going deep in the hole. There's one that is said to be a play at second base. And I thought, well, if that's a play at second base, the photographer's going to be in center field. And only later, as I've done research on this set, did I realize it is at second base, but it's very likely a staged photograph taken during spring training. There are about 6 that were taken during spring training. There are also a few that are taken on the sidelines before games, but most are action shots. And there are some extraordinary action shots where the very fast shutter speed freezes action. You sense the violence of a collision. You sense the ball frozen in midair. You then see the caption on the back, and what's described is this was a new way that people were depicting and understanding the game.
Yeah, and I'm not a baseball card expert, but the next baseball card set that I can think of that showed game action in the form of an actual photograph wasn't until the World Series cards in the 1960s that you talked about. Topps didn't have true photographs of game action in their true base cards until 1971. So these cards were so ahead of their time.
I think so. I think that may be right. I don't know if there was anything else in between, but that may well be the case.
Back to how these cards were distributed. Did they come folded, or was there an expectation from the makers that the collector would fold them once they got them?
No, they came folded, and they had to be folded. And in my book, I do have a photograph where I show a package and I show how the card folded over and inserted would have fit inside. And it's an interesting point when we think about the conditions of the cards today, because oftentimes cards that wear, the corners wear. Mm-hmm. But here, the four most extreme outside corners, once the card is folded, they are no longer the extreme.
Yeah, they were protected.
They were protected. So there's this kind of paradox with these cards that sometimes what we think of as the extreme corners are actually in better shape than, what do we call them, the inner corners or the intermediate corners. Mm-hmm. That said, some people folded these in the middle. I have no idea why they would do that. They came already folded. Why you would want to fold them again. But, people do all kinds of things with cards. And in those days, people probably didn't pay a lot of attention to these cards. So you find them in all kinds of conditions now.
Was the size of the center panel determined by the size of the tobacco packs that were housing the cigarettes?
Well, let's just say that the size of the Hassan cigarettes was large enough to accommodate this triple folder card folded over.
Yeah, okay.
What I cannot answer is if you lined up all the cigarette packs that were sold at that time, was the Hassan pack larger than many other packs? I don't know. It's possible that there were smaller packs that only could have accommodated a card as big as a T206 or T205, but I don't know that.
Yeah, interesting. So because of the fact that these cards came in packages of Hassan cigarettes and that the cards folded, the T202 set is also known as the Hassan Triplefolder set. It has the T designation as in T202 because it's one of a number of card sets which was available through the purchase of tobacco products. American Tobacco was formed by 5 companies: W. Duke & Sons, Allen & Ginter, W.S. Kimball & Company, Kinney Tobacco, and Goodwin & Company. It commercialized baseball cards through its brands Fatima, Hassan, Mecca, Obac, and a handful of others. If you guys are familiar with the T206 set, all the advertisements on the back of those are generally the different brands. What do we know about Hassan and about the actual product of their cork tip cigarette?
Well, all I know about it is that it was a cork tip cigarette in an era when most cigarettes had no filter as we now think of them. Mm-hmm. And so this was an innovation at the time to have a cork tip that would, I suppose, produce a milder smoke. You're talking to a non-smoker, so I can't say a lot about that. But I think it's also worth noting that Hassan was, to my knowledge, one of the leading brands, and they had many different card sets issued in their packs, not just the triple folders and not just baseball cards. You've got Hassan cards of lots of other things too, flags and Indian chiefs and lighthouses and all sorts of things, anything that the tobacco companies could do to make somebody want to buy more to complete a set.
And the American Tobacco Company wasn't experts in Native Americans or the flags of the world or in baseball, so they must have been contracting out to create the inserts that were going into their products. Who do you think they contracted out for the T202 set?
Well, it's my guess they contracted out. I mean, I'm sure they had a marketing department that was interested in promotions of various kinds. Mm-hmm. How much they did in-house and how much they contracted out, I'm not sure anybody knows, but it stands to reason they didn't have resident experts about Indian chiefs and butterflies and flags of the world. Mm-hmm. So who did they look to for this? It's quite clear from a number of points they looked to Spalding. Spalding, not only a maker of sporting goods, but also of the Spalding Guide. It was an annual guide that came out. And there are a few reasons why it's pretty clear that there's a very close connection between the Spalding Guides and the T202 sets. And it has to do with the end panels and the center panels and the captions. The end panels are the same as the T205s, and those were based on photographs taken by the Paul Thompson Studio in New York, and those photographs appeared in the 1911 Spalding Guide. Just about everybody on every team was featured. They went in and did a sitting. Those photographs appeared in the Spalding Guide, and then that same year were used in the T205 set. So the fact that it's the same year suggests that it wasn't done for one purpose and then used somewhere else. It was done at the same time. So Spalding was involved in the end panels. It also, I think is pretty clear, was involved in the photographs for the center panels. Why? Because the plurality, and probably the majority, of the center panel photographs we know were taken either by Louis Van Ooyen, who was based in Cleveland and was a photographer for the Cleveland Press, or Charles Conlon, who was based in New York and was a photographer for the New York Evening Telegram. They worked for those newspapers, but they also were under contract with Spalding to provide photographs that appeared in the Spalding Guides. So if you look at the 1911 or 1912 Spalding Guides, you will have photographs by Louis Van Ooyen, by Charles Conlon, and a number of those photographs were used for center panels in the set. So you've got a pretty strong relationship there. The backs of the cards have captions. Well, who writes captions? Well, people who write the Spalding Guide probably can write captions on cards, and in at least one case, there is a verbatim similarity between what's on the caption of a card and what's in a Spalding Guide. So for all of those reasons, you put it together, and my guess is that somebody at the American Tobacco Company contacted Spalding and said, look, we want to do a set. Can you furnish us with the end panels, the center panel photographs, and captions on the back? And my guess that's what Spalding did.
Cool. The T206 set came out between 1909 and 1911, and then the T205 set came out in 1911. But the T202 set came out in 1912. And it's always bothered me that those numbers don't go in numerical order chronologically. But now we know that it's because Jefferson Burdick and his American card catalog, Burdick didn't always necessarily know what year or years certain card sets were released. So sometimes he would just name a set and then catalog it that way. So what was Jefferson Burdick actually calling this card set when he referred to it to himself? Do you know?
One thing I'm going to do when I go home, I'm going to take my Burdick guide off the wall and see what he called them. I don't know the answer to that.
Do you have an original, or do you have a reprinted version of it?
I do have an original.
Amazing.
Yeah, I have an original.
Cool. The T205 set itself has two different designs, which is kind of carried over to the end panels of the T202 set. Is there any logic to the way some of the faces are framed with baseball bats and others were framed with a quasi-baseball diamond behind them?
Well, the biggest difference is that American leaguers have smaller portraits with more decoration around, and the National Leaguers have less decoration and just larger portraits and more detailed, and I think in some ways more interesting, more satisfying. Why among the American leaguers some had catcher's masks and gloves and others, I don't know the answer to that.
My other question about the artistic vision of the set is, why did they use the illustrations on side panels as opposed to the photographs themselves? Because clearly, based on the center panels, they have the technology to print a photo. So why were they using illustrations of photos on the end panels instead of the photos themselves? Do we have any insight as to that?
Well, no, we can just speculate. I think that when you take a Paul Thompson photograph, which was a very sharp, clearly rendered photograph, and you can see those, and I've reproduced many in my book because they're available in very high resolution at the Library of Congress, they took those and then they made, in a sense, illustrated portraits based on it. It's simply a question, in my mind, of visual appeal. There is something that is a little more appealing when you can add some color or tinting. They also modified a few pictures, which I can get to in a moment. So why did they do that? It wasn't just because, well, we didn't have the technology, as you point out, but you could ask the same question about the 1953 Topps, the 1951 Bowmans. They're based on photographs. The photographs exist. You can go on Facebook or Instagram where people like to show the original photograph.
I think it's different with a set like that, though, because there had been a precedent set with these tobacco cards that this is something that we do with baseball cards. We use illustrations in place of photographs, where at this point in the history of baseball cards, they're breaking new ground here with the use of the photographs. So I think you might have been onto something with the clarity of the portraits are so much different than the center panels that maybe they didn't want something that looks incredible on the end panel with something that doesn't quite match that same clarity in the center. But then my question would be, well, why not use the incredibly clear picture you've got and illustrate the center?
Well, I'd answer it a little bit differently. Let's look at not baseball cards, but all the other tobacco cards. Lighthouses, Indian chiefs, famous generals, none of those were black and white photographs. They were all stylized, colored, beautiful. Some of them, I'm sure, adapted from photographs. So the norm at that time was to have a beautifully rendered, colored, drawn image. And that's what the T205s were, and that's what the end panels were. The real difference then is to have those flank a black and white photograph.
Yeah, and I think that was my point, is that this set is breaking from that norm of having the stylized, like if you're making the choice to go with an actual photograph, why not use the clear version? So that's just something I've always kind of wondered.
I think that'll be something that we can speculate about. I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely not going to be an answer. The set has 144 different end panels and 76 different center panels throughout. Some of these panels appear multiple times within the set with numerous combinations of end cards, but there are 137 different players represented in the set, including a large number of Hall of Famers. There's lots of New York Giants represented, lots of Cubs, not a whole lot of Browns, Rustlers, or Naps, but every team has at least 4 players. Who are some of the key players included in the set who are worth mentioning briefly here before we kind of get more in depth on some of them later?
Well, of course, with the exception of Honus Wagner, who doesn't appear on tobacco cards, you have all of the greatest players of the era. So you've got Cobb and Mathewson, Tris Speaker, Cy Young in what was his last card. But then you've got people like Home Run Baker, Big Ed Walsh, Chief Bender. Those are all players that I knew about. I think through learning about the set and doing the research on the set, I came to learn about a lot of other players that are maybe not as well known, but somebody like an Ed Kenichi, Jake Daubert, Russ Ford, Eddie Seacott's in the set. Hal Chase and George Stovall are, in a sense, stars of the set because they were first basemen playing at Hilltop Park, New York, where Charles Conlon was clicking away. And so a lot of Hal Chase. George Stovall, first baseman for the Cleveland Naps, where Louis Van Ooyen was clicking away. Mm-hmm. And then you can say, well, who were the third basemen? Well, Jimmy Austin was third baseman for the Highlanders, or later the Yankees, until he was traded to St. Louis. When the card comes out, he's on the St. Louis Browns, but the photographs were taken a few years before, so you've got a lot of Jimmy Austin at third base. So these are some of the players that you see over and over. Chief Myers is maybe the most common in the set because there are so many Giants, and he is paired with about a half dozen Giants pitchers. So Chief Myers appears many, many times.
You mentioned Hilltop Park. 1912 was the last season in Hilltop Park's existence, so pretty cool to capture it in this set. The T202 set has a couple players who did not appear in the T205 set. You got Walter Blair and Joe Wood, the ones that I know about. The backs of the T205 cards advertise that set has, quote, 400 designs, which is, of course, far greater than what was actually produced. There are many theories as to why this discrepancy exists, but I can't help but to wonder if Blair, Wood, and possibly others were at some point intended to be a part of the T205 set, but just snuck into the T202s instead.
I don't know the answer to that, and I need to go back and look and see the back of the T205 that promised there were that many designs. Why would there have been that many? Because if you had 16 teams and about 25 players per team, well, that's 400. And there were very likely, if you look at the 1911 Spalding Guide, you probably have about 400 portraits there taken at the Paul Thompson studio. So it would stand to reason that the population you could draw on was about 400, 25 times 16. Why they didn't produce that many, I couldn't tell you. However, there were, I think, 206 in the T205 set, and many fewer found their way into the T202 set. There are a number of players, prominent players, Germany Schaefer being one, there's several others, who are inexplicably missing from the T202 set. They appear in the T205, and they are on center panels of the T202 set, but not end panels. You also have Sam Crawford. For heaven's sakes, why is there not a Sam Crawford? He has 2 center panels. And when I say he has 2, I mean there are 2 center panels that show him. One, he's on the base path, and one, he's at bat, and he is described in the captions on the back, but they didn't see fit to make an end panel of him, nor Napoleon Lajoie. Conversely, as you mentioned a moment ago, the 2 who somehow sneak into the T202 set, Walter Blair, Smokey Joe Wood. Well, Smokey Joe Wood, I'm thrilled they have him because, my gosh, he won 34 games that year, and you can't tell the story of 1912 without talking about Smokey Joe Wood. He had an excellent year in 1911. I don't know exactly why he wasn't featured in the T205s, but they saw fit to add him in the T202s. Blair was never even a starting catcher, and he was gone from baseball very soon after, so how he got in the set, I couldn't tell you that. The other player I wish was in the set is Grover Cleveland Alexander, who did have a great year, but I think if they hadn't snapped your picture the year before to be able to include you in the 1911 Spalding Guide, you probably wouldn't be in the set. And that also applies to Joe Jackson,
Yes.
who is not named on the center panel, but makes an appearance on a center panel. So he's another person that, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we had a Joe Jackson, but we don't.
It's interesting to me that Napoleon Lajoie doesn't have a card specifically because one of the photographers of this set was Van Ooyen. And so you think the team is called the Naps at this point. You've got a ton of Cleveland people highly recognized in this set. You're not going to have the guy who the team is named after, like the captain of this team, one of the best. He is approaching 3,000 career hits for a team that is well represented in this set with a photographer who's taking tons of these pictures. It's always been very strange to me that he doesn't have a card in this set.
Yeah, and where he does appear on a center panel, he's at bat. And it's a card whose caption is "A Great Batsman," which he was. But he was mainly, that year, a second baseman. And you don't have any photographs of somebody playing second base, with the exception of Jack Knight in the one that I said was staged. There are a lot of photos of George Stovall, who's a big, strong guy playing first base. And for a long time, I thought, that's not Stovall. That's got to be Lajoie. He's, big, strong, hefty guy. But in fact, it was Stovall who appears on almost all these photographs.
Another thing that this card set has that is uncommon for card sets of that era are captions on the back. There are large captions on the center panel as well as on the side panels. The T206 set has beautiful logos on the back like we talked about, but those aren't captions. And the T205 set has some small captions. If you take all the text from all the captions on the back of the panels from the T202 set and transcribe them, you've got a book that's got about 50 pages worth of words. What do those captions tell us?
Well, they tell us a lot. They tell us about the players, where they came from, their careers, the villages and towns and coal mines and mill towns and agricultural areas they came from. So you get a sense of how people were drawn into the game from all around the country. You learn about their careers. You learn about the way the game was played, the words that were used to describe various plays, and you learn something about how performance was measured. What were the statistics that were used to capture performance in those days? Well, batting average was around in those days, and home runs were around in those days, but there was no such thing as a run batted in. People didn't count that. There are a few allusions to he's good at chasing his teammates to the plate, but there was no statistic that was recognized until about 1920. You measured pitchers by wins and losses, but there was no sense of an earned run average. There were some, we say, well, he didn't give up a lot of runs, but there was no way to measure that. So we learn about measuring of player performance. We learn about tactics that were used. We learn about where the players come from. And we learn something about the way the game is understood with the advent of fast shutter speed photography. Because the great thing about many of these photographs, they are capturing a split second, 1/1000th of a second, with a ball frozen in midair or a play at the plate. And you see the way the sports writer, somebody from Spalding likely, was describing the action, and oftentimes rather quaint or, to our ears today, slightly archaic ways of describing things.
The way you've laid out your book takes us through the 1912 Major League Baseball season using the T202 cards as the vehicle to tell the stories. What is it about the 1912 season that makes it such a special year to document?
Well, I think it's a very happy coincidence that the year that the American Tobacco Company came out with the T202s happened to be a very interesting year. If they had come out with the set in 1911, you could probably tell a story about 1911. But I think it's a happy coincidence because 1912 does turn out to be a very historic year. You have great individual performances. You have Smokey Joe Wood winning 34 games, Rube Marquard winning 19 in a row, Owen Wilson, Chief Wilson of the Pirates hitting 36 triples, a record that still stands. You have openings of 3 baseball stadiums. Fenway Park opens, still around today. Redland Field, later Crosley Field in Cincinnati, opens. Navin Field in Detroit opens. And so there are events around each of those. you have a magnificent World Series between the Red Sox and the Giants. Some people say the first great World Series that went 8 games because the second game was tied. I'm not going to say these were the tightest pennant races. There were ebbs and flows. It was an interesting year, but this wasn't like the 1908 season that came down to a very dramatic finish. By the end, the Giants and the Red Sox really had pulled away. And you have things that are going on off the field. In May, Ty Cobb famously goes into the stands at Hilltop Park in New York and beats up a fan and then is suspended, and then the Tigers go on strike, and that leads to intrigue about player unions and representation and discipline. So a lot went on. But as I say, I think it's a happy coincidence that all those things happened in 1912, the same year this came out, and it's also the year that I think is mentioned more than any other in Lawrence Ritter's book, The Glory of Their Times, which was, for many people, myself included, our entree into learning about the dead ball era. And there, I think it is, again, a happy coincidence. He just happened to talk to a disproportionate number of Giants and Red Sox who talked a whole lot about 1912. So there I am, a 15-year-old in 1970, and Ritter's book has come out, and they've even made a little documentary about it that you can watch. And then I come across these cards, and all those things kind of fit together. But as I say, I wouldn't read too much into it. I think the stars just lined up in 1912. Historic season, great set, talked about in a fabulous book.
You mentioned that the pennant races weren't too close. The New York Giants won the National League pennant. They went 103-48 that year. They won the pennant by 10 games over the Pirates, who were in second place. The Boston Braves finished last in the National League. They were 52 games out. In the American League, the Boston Red Sox went 105-47, and the second place Washington Nationals finished 14 games back. The New York Highlanders were 55 out in last place. So lots of bad teams in these days. 5 of the teams in the National League finished with a record under 500, but the 2 teams at the top were just absolute front runners and great teams.
But the story's a little more interesting than that. Yes, there were some bad teams. The Boston Braves were bad. The St. Louis Browns were a bad team. There were some teams that were never in contention. However, there's at least 3 interesting storylines in terms of the ebbs and flows of the seasons. One is that the Cubs had been expected to do very well and actually challenged and got within 4 games by late August. And there were some head-to-head series in Chicago and later in New York where had the Cubs done a bit better, they could have closed the gap. People were expecting that to happen, and it did happen in terms of coming close together. They then faltered at the end, and the Pirates passed them. But really, the Cubs challenging the Giants was a major storyline. The team that you haven't mentioned there, because they didn't finish first or second,
the Philadelphia Athletics,
is the Athletics.
Yes.
They were the 2-time defending champs.
Yes.
And then, lo and behold, in 1913, they win it all again.
They went 90-62, so they finished in third, and they were 16 back.
And they did well, but the really extraordinary performance wasn't how badly they did, it was how well the Red Sox did. But even so, even though the Athletics got off to a slow start, coming into the 4th of July at Shibe Park in Philadelphia, they were hosting the Red Sox for a 6-game series. You say, 6 games, how could that be? Well, it was supposed to be 5, but there had been so many rain delays from bad weather in April that it was a 6-game series. And had they taken, let's say, 5 out of 6, it would have been a very different pennant race. And so those were hard-fought matches, but the Red Sox took 4 of the 6. They came to town with about a 6-game lead. They left with an even bigger lead, and the Athletics really never figured after that. The Senators, or the Nationals, they went by multiple names. I mean, they were also called the Washingtons. They were called the Washington Americans. There was a lot of ways that teams were referred to in those days. They also mounted quite a challenge toward the end. So there were a number of subplots that went on that year, although, yes, at the end, from middle of September on, it was very clear it was the Giants and the Red Sox.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the 1912 American League MVP voting. Of the top 7 players, 4 of them were either Washington Nationals or Philadelphia Athletics. Eddie Collins, the second baseman for the A's, and Frank Home Run Baker, the third baseman, finished 6th and 7th, respectively. And then you've got Walter Johnson, who finished 3rd in American League MVP voting, and Clyde Milan, the center fielder, finished 4th, both from the Washington Nationals.
And finished ahead of Smokey Joe Wood with 34 wins and 5 losses, finished 5th. How do you like that? But Tris Speaker had a magnificent year, and he finished first. So was there Did some people who were voting for Boston go with Speaker to the detriment of Wood? Who knows? But yes, there were some fine performances.
There have been 24 times in the history of baseball when an individual player had 13 or more wins above replacement in a single season. Of those 24 individual seasons, only 5 of them have happened after 1900. Of those 5, one of them was Babe Ruth in 1923, one of them was Doc Gooden in 1985, and the other 3 are Walter Johnson in 1912, 1913, and 1914. Johnson had 15.4 WAR in 1912, 16.6 in 1913, and 13.0 in 1914. So he starts an unbelievable stretch in 1912. He'd already been a great pitcher, but this was like the absolute peak of his dominance.
Yes, and when I mentioned earlier the Cobbs and the Mathewsons, I should have mentioned Johnson as well, of course. He was at his peak then. I didn't know that statistic about the concentration of such high wins above replacements early in the century ramping down over time, but hearing this for the first time, what it reminds me of is the analysis that Stephen Jay Gould did about the demise of the 400 hitter.
Yeah.
And that what you see in many systems is over time, they become more mature and extreme performance is diminished and things move more towards the middle. So the very high performers, the very low performers become scarcer and you see more of a concentration towards the middle. And that may be a reason why. There are some on the high side. There are also some on the low side. One of the players featured in the set is Bill Bergen, who was a catcher for the Dodgers and I think has the record for the lowest batting average of anybody with more than 3,000 at-bats. And you look at him and you say, how on earth did he last in the big leagues this long? Well, your guess is as good as mine. But there was room for great players and there was apparently room for some not so good players. There's one story I tell in the book about Dolly Gray, a player for Washington who walked 6 batters in 1 inning and then settled down and finished the game. And you think, well, what manager left him in after walking 6 batters?
Right.
But there's just some charming little anecdotes like that you find when you dig in to learn about what went on.
This being the first year of Fenway Park is significant, and not to ruin the ending, but the Red Sox go on to win the World Series in 1912. Your first trip to Fenway was on a ballpark tour of the East Coast you took in 1973. Tell me about that trip.
Oh, boy. I had been to Candlestick Park many times as a boy. I had been to see the Oakland A's when they moved out in 1968. I spent my freshman year in college in San Diego and went to see a few Padres games, but it was a big deal when that summer I was on the East Coast and I went to Boston for a weekend. I arrived there on a Friday and there had been a rain out, which meant, lo and behold, there was a doubleheader the next day. And in those days, you could walk up to the ticket booth, buy a ticket, and I did. I got there as early as I could. I walked around the stadium. I took some snapshots of Carlton Fisk and Yastrzemski, and Dwight Evans was already there, and watched that doubleheader, and that was wonderful. And I still have some of those pictures. And then the next week, I went back to the school I was going to that summer, and one of my friends said, "Oh, we missed you this weekend. Where were you?" I said, "I went to Boston." He said, "Oh, I'm going to New York this weekend. You want to come?" I said, "Yeah." And the Yankees were at home. And
Awesome.
So we went to Central Park and the Staten Island Ferry, and then he had a wedding to go to and said, "Right, here's where you get on the subway and get off at 161st, plunk down $4 for a box seat, and have some wonderful photographs there." And I had no idea that that was the last year of the old stadium.
Yeah.
So I've got it was an Instamatic camera. It was not a great camera, but I took some interesting shots that came out very well. So that was a real twofer. That was June 23rd and June 30th of 1973.
Cool. Your love of stadiums is clear in this book. You also include these gorgeous high-resolution scans of old stadium postcards. Those are something I collect too. How did you get into that, and what is it about them that does it for you?
Well, growing up where I did, the only games that were televised were the 9 games when the Giants played the Dodgers in Dodger Stadium, and they were televised by a local station, KTVU Channel 2. And so you would watch those. And then NBC had a game of the week on Saturday, maybe from Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park. But I was a Giants fan, and when you grow up on the West Coast, if your team is traveling, oftentimes they're in the Midwest or on the East Coast, and the games are night games, which for me were late afternoon.
Yeah.
I come home from school, I'm doing my homework at 4:15, Giant pregame show. And so I listen to the games, and here's Russ Hodges saying, hello, everybody. Here we are at Crosley Field, Cincinnati, or Connie Mack Stadium, Philadelphia. I had no idea what these places looked like. No idea. All I knew was Candlestick Park. So in the summer of 1964, a family friend was visiting her family in Philadelphia, and she sent me a postcard, and it said, "Dear Phil, thought you might like to see where the Phillies play ball."
Cool.
Here was this great postcard of Connie Mack Stadium, and I looked at it and I thought, well, this is nothing like Candlestick Park. I mean, this is an old stadium, and it's compact, and it's intimate, and it's historic.
Was that image of the inside of it or the outside? Like, did you see the cupola?
No, it was the inside. It was the inside.
Yeah.
So that was in maybe July of 64, and the next month our family went down to visit some friends of ours in Los Angeles, and so for 5 cents I bought a postcard of Dodger Stadium. And then every time my dad went on a trip, I'd say, "Hey, can you pick up a stadium postcard?" So Yankee Stadium and Comiskey Park. And then I began to collect these more seriously and amassed quite a nice collection. So all the ones in my book are scans of my postcards, and even when my baseball card collecting days pretty much finished, I continued collecting stadium postcards, which have always been a real love of mine.
It's funny the two types of different people there are when you hand them a baseball stadium postcard. I'm the type that I want to see the picture, and my mom is the type that she doesn't really care about the picture. She wants to see, are there words written on the back, and what is the story? Which one of these two are you?
Well, I'm definitely the first, but I do flip them over.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, there's some cool stuff you find on the back.
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, apropos of nothing, just because I'm nosy, there was one, this is a postcard I have of Comiskey Park. It's from maybe 1911. And a lady is writing to her husband and saying, "I hope you're having a good time, and I hear you're a good cook, and shall have you cook me a dinner when I get home," which I thought was very nice. But that has nothing to do with baseball. Let me tell you a baseball one. I've got one from the 1911 World Series. It is a beautiful postcard of the outside of Shibe Park. And you flip it over, and the person says, "First pitch about to begin, gotta run," or something like that.
Cool.
And the postmark is the day of the first game of the 1911 World Series.
Wow.
And so you realize this was somebody who was about to go to a game and letting somebody know. You know, today they would send a text, "Hey, I'm at the ballpark."
Right.
In those days, you would send a postcard. But no, I'm very much care about the image.
Mm-hmm.
There were what they called pre-linen, which were followed by linen images, which have that sort of textured finish.
Mm-hmm.
But the pre-linen were the older postcards from about the turn of the century, from maybe 1905 until the mid-30s. Then the linens, and then they went to what they call chrome, which were just the very clear and high-resolution photographs. And then they went to the larger ones after that.
Yeah, I've got one in my collection that the writing on the back is talking about how Henry Aaron is about to break the record, and it's postmarked and written the day he breaks the record.
Yeah,
I do read the backs, but my first inclination is I want to see the picture. I want to see what is the stadium I'm looking at, and then the back is like, oh, that's cool too.
Yeah. And there's some interesting anomalies. For example, there were no commercial postcards of Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Probably because you got the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial, and the White House, and the Capitol Building, and so who cares about a baseball stadium? There's other places where the stadium figures very, very prominently. And then there's the ones that you just think, oh, why didn't somebody take a center field aerial view from this angle?
Yeah.
So you mentioned Shibe Park.
Yeah.
There's some wonderful ones of Shibe Park, but there's none from center field. There's an Ebbets Field view from center field.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of other ones from center field.
It's also nearly impossible to find Columbia Park, which was the park in Philadelphia before Shibe. Its last season was 1908, so these postcards weren't really hugely popular yet. So I think that's part of the reason. I've got one in my collection, but they're very hard to find.
There is one that I know of, and I do have one where there are more and for that matter, exhibition in Pittsburgh, which was where the Pirates played before 1909 when they moved to Forbes Field. And you've got some that show the river, and in a corner you can say, well, this is a little bit of the stadium, but does that count or not? And that's not really a postcard of the stadium. That's a postcard of the neighborhood where a little bit of the stadium is visible. So that kind of thing goes on as well.
Yeah.
There is one of Griffith Stadium, but it was, if my understanding is correctly, it is a black and white postcard that was published by Eastern Airlines. But it was not a commercial card that you would buy on a postcard rack somewhere in downtown Washington.
Your book is just so beautifully done. I love the way that it's laid out and how you tell the story, but you're not a graphic designer. So how did you turn your vision for this book into a printed book that you can hold and we can read?
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased with how it came out visually. So what I knew I wanted to do, Dan, once I had completed the set, and this goes back now several decades actually, I wanted to create an annotated presentation of this set. I have at home an annotated Sherlock Holmes where places and people and historical events are cited and annotated, and you can just dig so deeply into it. I have the same thing for a beautiful illustrated version of Huckleberry Finn, where all kinds of place names and events are expanded upon. Mm-hmm. I had the idea that the T202 set had so much of interest visually and in terms of words that I wanted to do an annotated version. The question then was how to go about doing it. And I hit upon the idea eventually that instead of just presenting the cards alphabetically or by team, I would use the cards to tell the story of the 1912 season.
Yeah.
That still doesn't answer your question, which is how you go from the idea of doing it to actually doing it. So the missing link here is a book that came out maybe 8 years ago or so called Game Faces, which is a beautiful book. It was the accompaniment to Smithsonian Institute exhibit of baseball cards. And the book that was sold, I thought was just visually beautiful. So I wrote to the person at the Smithsonian and I said, who did you work with? And he put me in touch with the designer, who is a gentleman named Antonio Alcala, who has a company called Studio A in Alexandria, Virginia. He is a brilliant graphic designer. He's done catalogs for art exhibits. He's done postage stamps. There are a lot of U.S. postage stamps that he has designed. There was one of Yogi Berra not long ago. He did that one.
Cool.
There was a long one of Wilt Chamberlain. Of course, long, extra long Wilt Chamberlain. And he did that. So I contacted him, and I've never met him. I mean, I've Zoomed with him several times. But I told him I had this idea. And he was the person who understood layout. So everything in the book about fonts and colors and spacing is really Antonio. But the words are mine, the sequence is mine, the images we picked were mine. So it was very much a team effort. Yeah. And of course, when I say team, Antonio has a team of people working with him who are terrific. But we did this then over time. And it took a little while to figure out how to present the cards because, if you think about it, if you look at the card, there are 3 panels, left, center, right. But if you flip it over, the captions are going to be right, center, left. Right. Well, how do you get the caption correctly under? Do you put it to the side? Do you put it below? It seems obvious, but it wasn't obvious. Mm-hmm. There were other ways we could have done this. Then there was a lot of work to figure out how many cards I needed to display, because as you point out, there are 132 cards in the set, but, so this is my terminology, some of them are triple redundant, meaning the center panel exists on another card, and so do both end panels. You don't need to show that. And I didn't want to bombard the reader with more cards than necessary. Of course, many cards have at least one panel that's unique. Some have 3 panels that are unique. But I went through a process of saying, okay, if I have this one, then I don't need that one. If I include this, I don't need that. Yeah. But I want ones that face each other, that have something to say. They've got the same end panel players, or they have some commonality. So there's a long process I went through to figure out that I needed about 110 of the 132 cards. And I then found a sequence to tell the story from opening day in April through the last game in October. I don't introduce any new cards in the World Series. I let the cards of the set conclude with the last game of the season, and then I have other images that I bring in for the World Series. But I have great appreciation for the work that Antonio and his team did, because I think the visual effect is quite nice.
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful. Paul Referson, who knows more about the history of the actual ball when it comes to baseball than almost anyone I know, has said, there was nothing dead about the dead ball in 1911 and 1912. 1911 is kind of the height of the most elastic ball possible. They dialed the ball back for the 1912 season, but 1912 is still kind of a jackrabbit offensive season. You look at the top 10 offensive players according to WAR, you've got a who's who of baseball. You've got Tris Speaker, number 1, Ty Cobb, Shoeless Joe Jackson, who is in the middle of a 3-year stretch that rivals nearly any 3-year offensive stretch in the history of baseball. Frank Home Run Baker, Eddie Collins, Heine Zimmerman, Hannes Wagner, Wahoo Sam Crawford, Bill Sweeney, and Napoleon Lajoie. I mean, these are the best players in baseball history, so it makes sense that they're the top 10 guys in the offensive WAR for the year. Do you think that the excitement of baseball at this time helped the growth of baseball cards and people wanting to collect them? Like, do you think the offensive output and just these superstar players doing incredible things ties into how these cards became popular?
I hadn't thought about that before. I wouldn't want to say no, but I don't think I would attach disproportionate importance to that.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of things going on from 1903 onward. The National Agreement signed in 1903 that put an end to the bidding war and the rivalry between the American League, the National League. Major League Baseball was on a more solid economic footing. You didn't have players jumping contracts. And you had a lot of great performances by pitchers as well.
Mm-hmm,
So Big Ed Walsh and Christy Mathewson, and you've got these great pitchers for the Athletics, Bender and Plank and so forth. There were clearly some great players, both pitching and batting. Did the presence of some great batters by itself generate a lot of publicity for the game? It was probably one of several factors, but I wouldn't state too much. But what you did begin to see then here, Dan, was because of growing interest, growing media attention, newspapers, writing columns and so forth, what you were beginning to see then by 1908 was a more solid economic footing and owners who were able now to invest in the construction of concrete and steel stadiums.
Yes.
So that's why you have in 1909 Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, Shibe Park in Philadelphia. The next year you've got League Park in Cleveland, you've got Comiskey Park in Chicago, and a few others that add on there. And this allowed more fans to come, greater comfort. So I think there were a lot of factors. I
think the idea that baseball is a permanent thing now. You know, we're not playing these games in stadiums that in 4 years they're going to be somewhere else. Like this building that we're building is going to be a structure that is a part of the architectural landscape of this city forever. Like these were meant to be permanent places at this point.
That's right. And I reproduce some text from one of the guides, either Spalding or Reach, that comments on this and says, you know, now with the new Polo Grounds, we've got this great stadium, and Ebbets is now building a new stadium in Brooklyn that will open next year, and the Yankees are going to build the stadium in the Bronx. They didn't build the stadium that's described.
Right.
They had to wait 10 years to build one somewhere else that became Yankee Stadium. But what they were saying was these are going to be points of civic pride and real tourist attractions. So I think that's the case, yeah.
You mentioned the financial stability after the World Series agreement and that the two leagues weren't competing against each other, but it's interesting to me that this card set, had it come out 2 years later than it did, there would have been a possibility for them to include Federal League players. Have you given any thought to if that would have happened, or do you think this would have just been a National League and American League card set? Because like the T206 set has all sorts of different players. It's not just Major League. They had Minor League. They had all sorts of things. So do you think this set would have delved into the Federal League at all if it were to have come out 2 years later?
You know, that's anybody's guess. I really don't know. There were so many players, and many of them who were in the T202 set, who left their present teams to join a Federal League team, that you certainly couldn't have had this set 2 years later. Even if you had wanted to feature these players, you would have needed to show them on some other teams. So you're right. It's easy to talk about this financial stability in the industry of baseball, but then you have to understand that it was a bit short-lived because just 2 years later, there was this upstart Federal League, and that caused all kinds of things. So many players jumped that somebody like Connie Mack said, oh, you want to leave? You need more money? Well, good riddance. And you broke up his team, and you've got people moving to all kinds of other teams and occasionally coming back and so forth. Yeah.
Major League Baseball was primarily an East Coast venture in those days, but a fair number of players in the T202 set are from out west, with a few even being from California. Do the backs of the cards make any specific mention of that when they're talking about specific players? Like, was that noteworthy enough back then to be worth mentioning?
Yes, and not only was it mentioned that they were from these parts of the country, you have some rather quaint or slightly poetic descriptions. He comes from California, so he must be very tough, this kind of thing. Frank Chance comes from Fresno, the lands of the wine and grapes. Hal Chase came from California. You've got others who come from the Pacific Northwest, and then you have the ones who come from Kansas or come from Texas. Tris Speaker mentioned many times as a cowboy, a cowpuncher coming from the wilds. And you realize, well, this is probably written by people sitting in New York City, and they've never been to California. And they, you know, what's this wild place out there? So
it's the Wild West.
It is the Wild West. And a lot of these players would play minor league ball in California, but their stories, and Ritter talks about this in The Glory of Their Times, John McGraw would come winter in California. He liked going to the racetrack. He liked going to Santa Ana and places like that. And when he was there, he'd say, well, who are good young local ball players? Oh, Fred Snodgrass, you're a catcher. Why don't you come back with us? So there were stories like that. There wasn't the systematic scouting effort, but there were ways that good players in remote parts of the country would come to the attention of the big league teams.
The back of Christy Mathewson's end panel reads, Christopher Mathewson, idol of New York fans, has been one great factor in helping the Giants to their good standing, absolutely subduing the Athletics in 1905 and mowing down the Yankees in 1910, 14 in one game, were only samples of his work. His splendid control is shown by the fact that in 5 years, ending 1911, he only gave 242 bases on balls. Neither the Giants or the Yankees were in the World Series in 1910, and according to Mathewson's game log on Baseball Reference, the most players he struck out in a regular season game in 1910 was 11. New York's American League team wasn't even called the Yankees until 1913, although kind of culturally they had been called that a handful of times. But like you said, they were also known as the New York Americans and other names as well. Until that point, they'd been called the Highlanders, though, officially. So what is the back of Christy Mathewson's card talking about?
Okay, that's a great question because it's exactly that kind of thing that I asked myself. If you want to do an annotated presentation of a set, you read something and say, well, what's going on here? So everybody knows he beat the Athletics several times in the 1905 World Series, but for heaven's sakes, when did he mow down the Yankees? And the answer is in the 1910 City Series. So in many cities that had two teams, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago, New York, I don't think this happened in Boston, at the end of the regular season, if neither of the teams was in the World Series, the teams would get together for what was called a City Series, which happened either right before the World Series or during the World Series. If you look in Baseball Reference or any other official compilation of statistics, you will not find those games because, strictly speaking, they were exhibition games. Well, that's what we call them. But to the people at the time, whether it was the fans or the players or the reporters or the owners, these were every bit as important as the games during the regular season.
Yeah.
In some ways, they were more important. In 1910, neither the Giants in the National League nor the Yankees Highlanders in the American League were in the World Series. So when the regular season ended, they played each other. The Yankees that year had a great rookie pitcher named Russell Ford. Well, because there was no interleague play in those days, nobody knew what would happen when Ford went up against Mathewson. Well, how do you find out? The City Series. So the City Series was conducted that autumn, and Mathewson was dominant. He won several games, and that's what that was about. Mm-hmm. There was also a lot of coverage for the heroics of the Giants' third baseman, Art Devlin, who was written up in great terms. And so I describe that, and I say, long before Brooks Robinson in the 1970 World Series or Greg Nettles in the 1978 World Series, here's another example of brilliant play after brilliant play by a third baseman. Well, who remembers Art Devlin in the 1910 City Series? But he was, at that time, a real star at the hot corner.
Yeah.
But that's an example, Dan, of what I enjoy doing, annotating this. And that's what captions give you. If you don't have captions, you don't have a reference to something that you can then research. And there were a number of examples like that where I thought, oh, what's this about? And the kind of research you can do online now, never leaving your home, is extraordinary. So I tried to bring some of that to the benefit of the reader here.
The backs of some of the cards also make mention of records set by specific players during field day contests. What can you tell us about field days?
Well, field days were the idea of Gary Herman, who was the president of the Cincinnati Reds and also president of the National Baseball Commission. He had the idea of bringing together a lot of players and to have a number of contests. Who can run the bases the fastest? Who can circle the bases the fastest? Who can go from home to first the fastest? What catcher can hit a target at second base most accurately? How far can you throw? How far can you hit a fungo? And so forth. The first of the field days, to my knowledge, the first one I've recorded here, was in September of 1907, and this was held in Cincinnati, which was where Gary Herman was. It was before a game between the Pirates and the Reds. But not just members of the Pirates and Reds played. Because it was September, the minor league season was over. And so you had players from some minor league teams who came. Mm-hmm. And in the next years, when you had more of these, there were even players on big league teams whose teams were no longer in contention, who took a day or two away from their teams and came to field day.
Yes.
So here's one in 1907 in Cincinnati. There was a second one in 1910 in Cincinnati. And then there was one in 1911 in Chicago. And so there's mention on the back of some of the cards. Hans Lobert has one about being able to circle the bases in 14 seconds. Or you've got Ed Walsh. He's a pitcher, but he won the fungo hitting contest in 1911, hitting the ball 419 feet. So this was a lot of fun. And there were minor leaguers who did very well here as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what field day is. But that was, again, something that I saw mentioned on the back of a card, and I thought, well, what was this all about?
Yeah.
And looked into it. The last one that I talk about here was 1911, because the T202s came out in 1912. And there may have been field days in some years after that, but that's beyond the scope of what I did here.
Yeah, there definitely were, at least through 1917 that I know of. I'm not sure if they happened every year until then, but in 1917, a Boston sports writer named Tim Murnane passed away. And so the Red Sox at Fenway Park held a benefit game for him that was basically the second Major League All-Star game that ever took place. The first was 1911.
The Addie Joss
benefit game. This was the exact same concept. The Boston Red Sox were the home team,
right,
and the away team was all of the other American League All-Stars.
Okay.
Before that game, they held a field day. But like you said, it's September 27th. The White Sox had already clinched the pennant.
Yeah.
So they sent Shoeless Joe Jackson and Buck Weaver because the games didn't matter anymore.
Right.
Same thing with all the other American League players. You've got Ty Cobb and Rabbit Marinville, and Connie Mack is there, and like the who's who of the American League.
Yeah.
And one of the proudest things that Joe Jackson did during his life was winning the throwing contest at this field day. And he walks away with this huge trophy. And there are pictures of him till the day he died with this trophy on his mantle in his living room and holding it in his chair in front of the fireplace. Like, he loved the fact that because all of the best players were there, he took him winning that contest as proof that he had the greatest arm in baseball.
And that was distance or accuracy?
It was distance.
Okay,
he threw a
right.
ball 396 feet 8 inches on the fly, and he was upset that he didn't throw it 400. So now this is 1917. He's 30 years old. In his teens or early 20s, when he's still in South Carolina, he was known to throw a ball over 400 feet with regularity.
Wow.
So he was upset that he didn't break 400, even though he easily won this contest and blew away the competition. He was still upset that he didn't throw it farther. But in his mind, again, like, this made him the guy with the best arm in baseball.
So this is interesting. The 1911 field day, Fred Toney of the Cubs, 391 feet. But 1907, now who has heard of Sheldon Lejeune? He played for Springfield, not even a big leaguer, 399, 10 3/4 inches.
Wow.
Not quite 400 though. And there doesn't seem to be one in 1910. There was an outfielder's accurate throws. I don't know how they did that.
Interesting.
Yeah. Those are pretty cool. I mean,
Yeah.
the closest we have to that now, I guess, is the home run derby in the All-Star game, which is great fun to watch.
I would love to see that, because you describe in the book the accuracy throw from the catchers where they kind of like set up a flagpole and raise up a flag and the catchers have to hit the flag. That would be so exciting to watch. I don't know why they don't do it now. The teams just don't want to put their players in position to possibly get hurt in an exhibition.
I don't think a catcher's going to throw at his arm trying to be accurate. I think to throw as far as you can might strain the arm, but accuracy. But anyway, that's not for me to. But I agree. I think that'd be really cool. And I think to see who could circle the bases fast, I'd love to see that. Sure.
Is there a particular card back in the T202 set that you just absolutely love? Like, are there a couple stories that you learned from the card backs that surprised you or maybe endeared you to a specific player?
Yes. When I was 15, I acquired about 10 of these for not much money through an auction. And these are the ones that really galvanized my interest in collecting. And many of them were keepers. This one was a keeper. This is card 12. It's called Caught Asleep Off First. The end panel, you've got Roger Bresnahan, one of his two portraits, and Bob Harmon, who pitched opening day for the Cardinals. The Cardinals, not a great team at that time. Mm-hmm. But the photograph in the middle has a runner coming back to first base on a pickoff attempt, and you can see the ball caught in midair. And let me just read this, because I think it's quaint. It says, "In the long run, a game of ball is won by the display of wits rather than by physical prowess. Of course, the players must be skilled and fast, but this alone, without watching every play, will not avail against brains. Thus, in the picture on the reverse side of this card, the runner, who had reached first base on a base hit, took a long lead off towards second and then went to sleep. This made it easy for the pitcher to snap the ball over and catch him napping, and it was back to the bench for him. Note the peculiar position of the runner as caught by the camera, showing him just awakening to the realization that he can't possibly reach the bag in time." Well, this idea of wits and skill and mental acuity and so forth, that's all well and good. I look at this and I think, well, actually, the first baseman is reaching to his left to catch the ball. The ball is on the wrong side of the base. I've seen this play many times, and the runner's almost always back safely. I don't think he's out here. But this idea that he was caught napping and back to the bench, I thought that was a kind of quaint thing. And there are a number of ones like that.
Yeah.
There was also one that's a favorite called Good Play at Third. You've got George Moriarty playing third base and tagging out a runner who's got a C, so this is one of the many shot in League Park. It's a Cleveland nap coming into third. But the caption here quotes umpire Billy Evans. Well, Billy Evans was an American League umpire who had a long, distinguished career, but also wrote a baseball column on the side. And he is mentioned here as saying about George Moriarty, he had the Cubans crazy by his great base running. So I read that and I think, well, what's this about Cubans? So I looked into this, and what I found was that in November and December of 1910, after the regular season was over, the Tigers, who were not the champions and had not been in the World Series, went on a 12-game exhibition tour of Cuba. They played the Havana Reds and the Almendares Blues. And those teams were noteworthy because they not only had great Cuban players, but they oftentimes had in their ranks some Negro League players who at the end of the Negro League season would come down to Cuba and join them. And this was one of the first opportunities for top major league teams to play good competition against teams of Cubans and African Americans.
Yeah.
Well, as I read about this, and I went back and I found Billy Evans' columns, and I read about these games, not only were these teams very evenly matched, the story here is not how Moriarty drove the Cubans crazy. It was really how Bruce Petway, who was a black American catcher playing for a Cuban team, pretty much shut down the Tigers on the base paths, including Ty Cobb. So I thought this was interesting as well. And of course, it wasn't just the Tigers that year. In subsequent years, other teams, the Athletics, the Giants, would go on trips to Cuba. And these were early indications about the level of play of African Americans and Cubans as well.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that was another caption where, you look into these and you begin to pull on a thread and a whole story unravels there.
Yeah, and you can't get that reading the backs of the T206 set. As great as that set is, as iconic as those cards are, you can't have the experience that you have looking at the T202 set.
Correct. And to my mind, there's no accounting for taste. Some people like one, some like another. Some people aren't bothered about the words on the back, and others of us find the words on the back endlessly fascinating because they talk about the game and they talk about the vocabulary. And there are terms that don't show up. So there was one player and they say, oh, he sometimes bats from the left and sometimes from the right as his mood dictates. They never said switch hitter because as I looked into it, that's a term that only came about several years later.
Yeah.
You talk about emergency batters instead of pinch hitters or emergency pitchers instead of relief pitchers. You can see how the vocabulary of the game evolved. And for that, I would then try to look these up through encyclopedias. Total Baseball is a great book, but there's a book called A Game of Inches by Peter Morris. What a feat of scholarship that man did to trace the origins of so many terms, how rules changed, how tactics changed. So I try where I can to draw on that and to cite that.
Yeah. When it comes to collecting, the T202s are collected in three distinct ways depending on who is doing the collecting. Some people collect the entire card, some people like to collect just the center panels, and some people collect just the end panels. But that kind of makes this set a little more complicated to collect, especially when you consider all of the different combination variations. Card 1 is this guy and this guy, with another guy in the middle, and card 2 might have one of the guys on card 1, but with another combination of other guys. Do you think that the complexity of this set is one of the reasons why it has been largely overlooked and remains undervalued today compared to some of the other tobacco card sets?
I don't think so. I think why it is a little bit overlooked is for a different reason. But let me come to the first one when you talk about center panel only or end panel only. What you're referring to are cards that have been dismembered.
Right.
And I'm going to use that term. They were not just amputated cleanly, they would have been torn. When you take a triple folder card and you separate the panels, not that anybody today would do that, but I'm sure somebody back in 1912 or 1920 did that. In my view, you've destroyed the card.
Yeah.
Now, why anybody would want to collect a dismembered card, I have no idea.
I know some people who do collect them that way. A, it's much cheaper. You know, like if you're a collector of the Brooklyn Dodgers and you're looking for a Zach Wheat card and you can't afford one that's in its intended condition, this is a way to get a cheaper version of that and have that guy in your collection.
Look, if that's how some people want to look at it, fine. And maybe some of these are so expensive. You know, for example, one of the cards we haven't mentioned yet, but it is probably the marquee card, is card 75, Ty Cobb Steals Third. The center panel is probably the only one of the 76 center panels that is known to the average fan, and that's the very famous photograph of Ty Cobb sliding in at third base, upending Jimmy Austin. Everybody knows that photograph. Mm-hmm. That is a premium card, and I'm sure there are some people who say, well, the only way I find that affordable is to get that center panel. Okay, fine. If that's their reason, I can't quibble with that. But I personally find that to be a bit abhorrent. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that the, quote, complexity of the cards explains why they are sometimes overlooked. Because I don't think the card on its own is more complex. It's actually when it's been dismembered, it becomes more complex. I mean, the card as issued with the intact end panels and center panel, it's just a card. It's not more complex.
I think you even brought it up talking about laying out your own book. You had to make the decision, do I really need to include every single card when there are these duplications and triple redundancies?
Yeah. So then let's come to the question that you're also getting at, which is why does this set get a little less attention, a little less love than some other ones? Especially as I would say, gosh, you've got these great center panels, you've got these captions on the back. But if you look at a Ty Cobb in this set, and you compare that to a T205 Ty Cobb, which is the same image, which one is going to be, quote, valued more? It's going to be the T205. Mm-hmm. And the question is why? Mm-hmm. Why would the market, whoever the market, I mean, the market is the interplay of all buyers and sellers, all collectors and dealers and all this. The market, in its wisdom, says the single Ty Cobb T205 has a higher market value. Why is that? Well, I talk with people and ask about that. They say, well, this other stuff actually kind of detracts from the purity of the Cobb. I don't want Moriarty in Cobb. I don't want O'Leary in Cobb. I just want Cobb. And the other thing is how I store them and how I display them. I like my cards to be of a certain size, and here's these cards that are of a different set of dimensions. I don't know how to store them. I don't know how to present them. So I think there's a lot of people who just say, I like that image of Cobb, and I'm happy to have the T205, and I just don't need the rest of the stuff. Mm-hmm. So what I see as an enhancement and an addition, other people may see as a detraction, and, so be it. There's not a right or wrong there. I understand that. Mm-hmm. I do draw the line on the dismembered cards, though, okay?
When you have a pure card, like you just talked about, and hobby pioneer Michael Ehrenstein also has this notion of the pure card being just one player on the front, the card's value is based just on that player. But like you said, when it's a mix, if there's 2 players or 3 players featured on the card, that introduces some variables to the pricing. How were the player combinations on the cards determined? Like who's on the left panel, who's on the right panel? How did they pick who matches with who? Because you kind of brought this up earlier with Chief Myers.
Yep.
They matched him with a lot of the guys from his own staff. But the other combinations, it doesn't really seem to me like there's a rhyme or reason, but I haven't done the research that you have.
Sure. Well, there is a rhyme or reason. There are some exceptions, but as a rule, the players on the end panels are from the same team. So you've got 2 Cardinals, 2 Pirates, 2 Giants, 2 Cubs, whatever it may be. There are a few exceptions to that, but that's the general rule. And then the question is, all right, if those are the players on the end panels, what's the center panel? Mm-hmm. Where they could, the designer would pick a center panel that featured one of the players on an end panel. So if you've got a center panel of Russ Ford, well, it's on a card where Russ Ford is one of the end panels. Same with Hal Chase, same with Eddie Grant. There's a card, Grant Gets His Man, card 40. He's the center panel. He is one of the end panels. The exception to this is, after 1910, Thomas Lynch, president of the National League, forbade photographs taken of National League games, and therefore you will not find game action images of National League games from 1910 onward.
So are you saying that Major League Baseball having a problem growing their game by allowing people access to view their game is not a modern thing that's been happening for 115 years?
I have no idea what he was thinking at the time, but let me be a little more charitable to Mr. Lynch. Photographers in those days were kneeling feet away from fair territory because we didn't have telephoto lenses. They weren't perched up somewhere else, or they weren't in the photographer's wells with these enormous telephoto things you have now. Maybe there was some incident of a collision or getting in the way or who knows what, but in his wisdom, he said, no more photographers on the field for National League games from 1910 onward. We mentioned earlier, the plurality of photographs are either Charles Conlon taken at Hilltop Park or Louis Van Ooyen taken at League Park in Cleveland, which meant we had an abundance of American League action photos. And so one of the things you find in the set, you've got 2 Cincinnati Reds on the sides, and you've got Hal Chase of the Yankees in the middle. Well, how did that happen? Well, it happened because there were no photographs taken of games with Cincinnati Reds. Mm-hmm. Same with the Pirates. There are some photographs of Cubs, but they tend to be where we've been able to document the source of the image. It was from a game prior to 1910.
Yeah, interesting.
So there is a rhyme and reason here. The general rule is the 2 players on the sides were of the same team with somebody in the middle who was associated with them. I mentioned Chief Myers. Mm-hmm. He's on lots and lots of these. On one panel, a Giants pitcher on the other, and in the middle, you've got John McGraw of the Giants shaking hands with Harry Davis of the Athletics before the first game of the 1911 World Series. The caption is just before the battle, and that's card 48, which appears, there's like 10 versions of it.
Yeah, that's the first card from this set that I actually personally owned.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I also show early in the book the original photograph that was used for that center panel, because in the original photograph, in the background between Davis and McGraw is one of the umpires. Yeah. They airbrush him out for the card. So where I could, I tried to find examples of the original photographs used for the center panels to show how they were changed. In many cases, they would airbrush out the background, removing some of the detail and making the players portrayed that much more prominent.
Yeah. We mentioned earlier the Ty Cobb sliding image as the center panel. I think it's fair to say that just that middle panel would make the Ty Cobb the best card in the set, regardless of who the side panels would have been attached to it. But the Cobb sliding photo is the center panel of 3 different cards in the set. First is George Stovall and Jimmy Austin, then is Cobb with George Moriarty, and then one is Cobb with Huey Jennings. Is one of those 3 card variations more sought after than the other?
Well, I think the one of Cobb with his manager, Huey Jennings, is one of the marquee cards of the set.
Yeah.
If you take out the manager, Jennings, who was well known in his own right, and you put in a lesser-known player, Moriarty, I think that's probably a bit less. And then you've got these 2 St. Louis Browns. Well, why do you have them? Well, because the third baseman who's being upended on the play is Jimmy Austin. So they had the good sense to say, well, let's have one version with Jimmy Austin. But that's maybe one of the few examples where a center panel card is used with 2 different players who have something to do with what goes on in that image.
Mm-hmm. We would presume that cards with Ty Cobb or Walter Johnson or one of the other Hall of Famers from this set would be the most expensive cards in the set to collectors. But are there any surprises within the set when it comes to the values of them?
The most expensive cards, and I will tell you of the 132, there are 3 that I do not have, and they are all versions of cards that have Art Devlin of the Giants. Art Devlin was the Giants' third baseman through 1911, and then coming into the 1912 season, the Giants were going to put Buck Herzog at third. Devlin maybe was going to get less playing time, and so early in the season, in April, Devlin's contract was sold. I hate to say the player was sold, so I'm going to say his contract was sold to Boston. And in April of that year, then he shifted. Well, what did that mean? The cards were composed shortly before the season began, and there are cards that show Devlin with Christy Mathewson, and Devlin is listed as a Giant. But when the sale happened, they changed the card, and now Devlin is shown as a Rustler, which is what the Braves were called that year.
Right.
They actually went by the name Braves during the season, but for the purpose of the card, he was a Rustler. So if you imagine that all the other cards are printed in the same quantity, here is one that now has 2 versions, each of which is rarer. And the one that is rarer of the 2, Devlin as a Giant, is rarer than Devlin as a Rustler. And those are quite expensive. Mm-hmm. And I do have a Devlin, but I have a Devlin as a Rustler. And I just got to the point where I said, I'm not going to pay that much. And also pay that much to get a card that shows up in a slab, because I collected these cards before they came slabbed. Mm-hmm. And I have them in this book. And I don't know what to do with slabbed cards. The last few I bought to almost complete the set in the early 90s began to show up with grades and slabs, and that's not really what my collection was about.
Yeah.
So those are the rarest. The other one that for many years was said to be rare, and Lou Lipsett did an analysis of the T202 set, and he said this was rare, meaning there were just fewer out there, was card number 8 called Birmingham's Home Run. I don't know that it's rarer than the others. I haven't seen a count. I have gone on PSA, and I do see counts, but the problem with that, I think, is that all they know is what people submit.
Right.
And people tend to submit cards
that they think are valuable. Right.
So there's an adverse effect that goes on here.
Yeah.
It's not obvious to me that there are cards that are significantly rarer than others. One might imagine that a card that has a center panel and only one combination of end panels would be rarer than a card like the Ty Cobb that has 3 different versions. But that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
I don't know how they did the printing of the quantities on these. So the Devlin cards are the most expensive. On this point about Devlin, though, and that they were able to catch that card and change it, Walter Johnson appears twice. He appears once with Gabby Street, who was his longtime catcher on Washington.
Mm-hmm.
But before the card was issued, he was traded to New York, and they caught it in time, so that there is a card of Walter Johnson and Gabby Street, but Street is now on New York. Then there's a card that's got Walter Johnson and Jack Knight, who was the person Street was traded for.
Interesting.
And he is shown to be on Washington. So I looked at this, I said, oh, well, they never would have paired Walter Johnson with Jack Knight until that trade happened, and the trade happened in February of 1912. So you get a little sense of when the cards were composed,
Mm-hmm.
when they were printed, and at what point they could intervene and make alterations. But one isn't rarer than the other as far as I can tell. So the ones that are really rare in terms of scarcity and that drives value is the Devlin cards. There's others that are valuable not because they're scarce, but because, for heaven's sakes, it's Walter Johnson or Ty Cobb, and that's why they're valuable.
While you were a professor at the International Institute for Management Development in Switzerland, you work with managers from companies from all over Europe, from the Middle East, from Asia, from all over the globe, really, who were smart, hardworking, honest people, but they weren't always very good at understanding what was good research and what was bad research, or being able to make the distinction as to which was which. How have you brought that concept into your own life when it comes to doing the research about this T202 set? Because clearly you have done the research for this set to write this book.
So you're talking about my other life now. My professional life, I was a business school professor for many years. I did work in organization design, international strategy, and things like that. I moved to Switzerland in 1996, and I joined the faculty of IMD. And yes, indeed, I worked with primarily executives for many years, and I saw a general, I'd say, low level of critical thinking. And this is not a criticism of anybody. The people are smart and well-intentioned, but the fault really, I always said, lied on my side of the room. We did not teach people to be good critical thinkers. And so I began to shift more of my interest into helping managers think critically about claims that were being made. Critical thinking to me is about the evaluation of claims. And if somebody says, if you do this, this will happen, or here's the 6 steps to achieve this, or here's the 5 rules for this, those are claims. Do we accept those claims? Are they valid claims? Are they not valid claims? And so that gets us into questions of research design, what are valid data, and how we make valid inferences from data. So a lot of my professional career, away from the diamond, has been about critical thinking and helping people think critically about claims made. Now, this is all a slow way of getting around to what you're asking, which is, does that have anything to do with this book about T202s? I don't think there are claims being made here, and I'm certainly not making a claim that this is, the best or the. But the spirit of probing and trying to understand why and trying to find the backstory, I think there is a commonality between the spirit of inquiry and critical thinking that I brought to my professional career and the kind of curiosity and spirit of critical thinking that I've brought to this study of T202s and the 1912 season. So in that sense, it doesn't surprise anybody who knows me that I did these two different things, but one doesn't really speak to the other, I think.
Well, I think, when it comes to doing research about old baseball cards like the T202 set, you don't really always know with 100% certainty what's actually out there. We have a very educated guess at this point, but we don't know print runs. We don't know. Maybe there's a card that nobody's found yet.
Yeah.
With no official checklists and no public records of print runs, things like that. How do you go about doing that research so you know what's even out there? Forget writing the book. As a collector, you wanted to have everything in the set. So how did you do critical thinking and research in those terms to just know what existed?
Okay. If somebody comes along with an until now undiscovered T202, I will be prepared to revise,
Well, I'll give you an example because it was a fairly recent discovery within the hobby that one of the action shots in this set is Shoeless Joe Jackson. It's crazy that it wasn't until the last 15 or 20 years that it was discovered that it actually was Joe Jackson. And Joe doesn't make it onto a lot of cards during his career. He's not in the T205 set. He's not in the T206 set. He never appears in any serious tobacco set as a major leaguer. But here he is as a center panel in this set.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to kind of rephrase.
Mm-hmm.
I think from Jefferson Burdick to Lou Lipsett to all of the buying and selling that's been done, I think we know that there are 132 cards and what those cards are. And I think it would be astonishing if anybody came up with a
133rd card.
133rd. There is one variation that I'm aware of, which is there is one card of Johnny Evers where his background is a slight blue tint instead of a green tint. And that variation does exist, and I know that from several sources, and somebody sent me a copy of his. It wasn't good enough to include here, but I recognize that. Mm-hmm. So there may be some variations we have. I don't think there'll be new ones. But we continue to learn new things about them. I'll tell you something I learned about them in going from my first version, which was a softback that came out in 2021, and the hardback that we have here. There were a few center panels of Hal Chase at first base, and I thought, well, what park was this in? Well, it must have been Hilltop Park, because there's so many of him at Hilltop Park. But gosh, it doesn't look like Hilltop Park. There's these kind of rickety stands in the distance. And for heaven's sakes, what's the uniform of that runner? That's not a uniform I've seen before. I had no idea. I had no idea what it was. And there were a few other cards that to me were slightly anomalous. After 2021, when my softback came out, I began to get connected to people in the hobby who had great collections of original photographs. I then sent the call out. I said, anybody have photographs of some of these center panels? And several people came forward and said, I have this one, I have this one. And they very generously let me make copies, and I've thanked them in the book. Only last December, as I was getting towards publication, did I make the acquaintance of somebody else who said, oh, I have a center panel for this one. And so I got that one that had Hal Chase at first. And the back of it said, Spring Training, Athens, Georgia, 1909. And I said, oh, that's where that was. And then I did another search, and I said, what else do we know about Athens, Georgia, 1909? And then I found another photograph, not that became a center panel, but it was more of a, not panoramic, but it was a broader view that showed clearly some of the houses in the background that are the houses that are on other ones.
Cool.
And then I said, so this card was Athens, Georgia, this card, what else? And then I said, well, this one too. And then the one of Jack Knight at second base, Jack Knight catches a runner, house in the distance, Athens, Georgia.
Wow.
One of Russ Ford, Yankee, on the sidelines, pitching. The stands in the background, same stands. And I went there and said, here are 6 that I've now been able to identify.
Yeah.
At least I think I have. So I make the claim. I say, I think they're all from Athens, Georgia. So we can continue to learn more about what's in the cards. But let me come back to this notion of critical thinking. Very early on, you asked the question, what is it about 1912? And I said, I wouldn't attach too much importance. It's a happy coincidence that the same year the set came out was also a great year, was also the year that Larry Ritter talked about. That's my critical thinking skepticism coming out. Because it's easy to say, this all happened the same year and there was something intentional or causal here. But the spirit of critical thinking is to say, let's refrain from making causal attributions if we're not on very firm ground. And actually, oftentimes, Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the best. And the simplest here is, it's just coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely.
The cards came out in 1912, and 1912 was a great season, and Larry Ritter talked to people who are still alive. If a lot of Philadelphia Athletics had still been alive in 1963 to 65, we might have a very different group of people in the glory of their times. But a lot of Chief Myers was still alive, Snodgrass was still alive, and so forth. So how much of that is chance?
Yeah.
And so critical thinking to me,
Frank Chance wasn't still alive.
He was not. That is true.
Let's bring up the 1912 World Series then, as long as we're talking about how magical this season was. The Boston Red Sox defeat the New York Giants 4-3-1. Game 2 was called after 11 innings, ending in a 6-6 tie. So even though it was a best-of-7 World Series, they played 8 games. It's wild to think that a World Series game could have ended in a tie, and that instead of just picking up where they left off the day before, they scrapped the entire game and just played an entirely new game. I understand stadiums didn't have lights back then, so when it got too dark to play, they had to stop for player and for fan safety. But to me, it's just such a stark contrast to the commercialization of the World Series today. I genuinely cannot fathom what would need to take place today for a World Series game to just be abandoned instead of playing 23 innings if they need to into the early morning hours to finish the game. As Jacob Pomrenke writes, before Game 6 of the 1912 World Series, Smokey Joe Wood advised his friends and family to bet on his Red Sox before his scheduled start, with Boston ahead 3-1. Wood was the American League's top pitcher. He'd already beaten the Giants twice in the series, but instead of throwing Wood again, Boston manager Jake Stahl was ordered by owner James McAleer to start the unseasoned Buck O'Brien in Game 6. The Red Sox lost that game, and Wood, embarrassed and angered at having wrongly advised his friends, lost the next one too. Syndicated reporter Hugh Fullerton warned of gamblers' growing influence in baseball, quote, "The muckerishness of the fan is exceeding itself in muck this fall. Boston howled that it was all fixed, then raved over the team when it won. So New York screamed that the Giants were throwing the series. For comparatively trifling bet, Wood risked Boston's title and the wealth that accrued to the winners. Stamp out gambling, and the end of talk of crookedness is at hand." But bribes weren't the only manifestation of the gambling culture in baseball. With money on the line and the pennant race already over, players routinely eased up during meaningless late-season contests. This form of game fixing led to some farcical events on the field. So like I mentioned, Smokey Joe had already won 2 games. He does win 3 games for the Red Sox in this World Series, including the series clincher in Game 8, which was one of the wildest winner-take-all games in baseball history. The game went into extra innings tied at 1. The Giants scored in the top of the 10th to make it 2-1. Clyde Engel came out to bat in the bottom of the 10th and cracked a long fly ball to center field, where Fred Snodgrass famously muffed it and let Engel land on second base with a double, but it was really an error. As this great game writes, with 1 out, Christy Mathewson got Tris Speaker to pop one up into foul territory near Fred Merkle at first base. Merkle and Mathewson converged, along with catcher John Myers, who is often called Chief, and we've called him Chief throughout this episode. Back then, a lot of Native American players were called Chief. You've got Chief Myers, you've got Chief Bender, a couple other guys as well. Out of thin air came the words, "Take it, Chief, you take it," even though Myers had the worst angle on the play. It was Tris Speaker who was yelling that as he was running down the line. Merkle and Mathewson froze, and Myers couldn't catch up to the ball, which landed on the ground untouched. So giving himself new life at the plate, Speaker promptly lined a single to score Engel as the game's tying run, and sending Steve Yerkes to third base as the potential game winner. 2 batters later, Larry Gardner launched a fly ball to deep right, which was caught by Josh DeVore, plenty far enough for Yerkes to score the series-winning run after tagging up from third base. Fred Snodgrass took the brunt of the criticism for starting things off on the wrong foot defensively for New York, though many fans would focus on Snodgrass and his, quote, $30,000 muff, because that was the difference in the amount of money given to the winning team and the losing team in the World Series. There was plenty of blame to be shared among the Giants, who as a team committed 17 errors in the series, including 5 in the abandoned Game 2 that we talked about, which ended in the 6-6 tie. Mathewson, despite allowing just 4 earned runs over 28 innings, was tagged with 8 additional unearned runs and won none of his 3 starts, stretching his World Series winless streak to 5 games. So it was a very significant World Series. It just so happened to be the first year in Fenway Park's history. But like you said, none of that has anything to do with the fact that the T202 set came out that year. It's not like players were playing harder or playing worse or playing better. But that is part of the story, that like we have this magical season, and it's all documented on this incredible card set.
Yeah, I've read quite a bit about that series. I don't think I was familiar with some of the things you mentioned there. My sense was that McAleer is often blamed for starting O'Brien in Game 5, not for anything to do with gambling. He didn't want the series to end that day. He wanted it to come back to Fenway Park for more attendance. That's what I had heard, that it was more to get the extra gate. But if I can, I want to come back to your point about players taking it a bit easy. Although the Giants did win by quite a bit, they were challenged by the Cubs, and there was a series in Chicago. And after taking 2 out of 3 against the Giants went to St. Louis, and they played the Cardinals, managed by Roger Bresnahan, who was a former Giant and a good buddy of John McGraw. And the Giants won those 3 games very handily while resting some of their regulars, came back for a 4th game in Chicago, and the Cubs were incensed, and they claimed that Bresnahan was having the Cardinals lay down against the Giants. Any proof? Who knows? But of course, these things were common.
Yeah. In 2007, you published a book called The Halo Effect, which examines an interesting concept that the overall impression that everything in a company is good is based on its success, or that everything in a company is bad based on its lack of success. Essentially, that whoever's running the show must be a genius if things are profitable, or they must be an idiot if the business isn't doing well. A modern baseball example that stands out to me is Joe Torre as a manager. When he managed the Mets and never finished a season better than in fourth place, he was terrible. When he managed the Cardinals and his team only finished better than third place one time in 6 seasons, it was clear that he was washed up and had no idea what he was doing. It definitely wasn't the roster he was given in either scenario or the strengths of the other teams in those divisions. But then he gets hired by George Steinbrenner to manage the Yankees, and he wins 6 pennants and 4 World Series, and all of a sudden he's considered the best manager of the past 50 years. He's a genius who can handle the egos in a clubhouse better than maybe any other man who's ever held the role of manager. Did he probably get slightly better at being a manager between 1977 and 1997? Yeah, I'm sure his experience helped him learn and grow. But did he turn from a bumbling fool into an unparalleled mastermind over the span of 20 years? Probably not. Who are some examples of either teams or specific players in the 1912 season, or just from that era, who either benefit from or are hampered by the halo effect?
Well, until you said 1912, I was going to jump in with my favorite example here, not Joe Torre, but Casey Stengel.
Yeah.
Who was
absolutely
mediocre at best with a series of teams, the Boston Bees, and who else did he manage in the 30s and 40s? Went out, he managed the Oakland Oaks. And when the Yankees hired him in 1949, the New York press was saying, who's this clown we're bringing in? And then, of course, he's the old professor, and they go off on this incredible streak. The basic idea of the halo effect, as you describe, is we make attributions based on outcomes. When a company's successful, we say they've got a brilliant strategy, a great leader, the people are motivated, they're great at customer service, and so forth. And some of those things probably are true, because performance isn't just random. There is a reason why the company's doing well, but are all those things true? Probably not. And when that same company then has a downturn, we make the opposite attributions. I see that in sports oftentimes when it has to do with things like a winning culture. Well, if the team wins, they say, oh yeah, we had each other's backs, we didn't give up. Well, the other team probably had each other's backs and didn't give up too, but, the ball kicked foul or something happened and one team wins, and then because of the outcome, we make all of these attributions based on it. In 1912, to give you a good answer, I would need to go back and read and think about that, but I can tell you that there were managers who were fired because of the performance of the team. Sometimes you do fire the manager because you want to, quote, shake things up. But you probably shouldn't change the manager if you think that they were the cause of the problem. They are sometimes the person to whom we lay blame. So I would take your general point. I haven't looked at the 1912 season through that lens. I will, though, mention the Philadelphia Athletics. Because Connie Mack wrote years later, I never understood what happened to my team in 1912. They were too complacent. They woke up too late, this and that and the other. I looked at it and I said, the Philadelphia Athletics in 1912, yeah, they weren't quite as good as 10, 11, or 13, but almost. The real difference was the Boston Red Sox. Mm-hmm. And because the Boston Red Sox had a season for the ages, not just Speaker and Wood, but others as well, everything just clicked for them that year. Philadelphia looks worse by comparison. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, Mack didn't say, gosh, we had a terrible year, let's tear everything down and start over. He had pretty much the same team in 1913, and they win the World Series again.
Right.
So that would be an example to me about how we sometimes make attributions based on outcomes instead of looking at a more granular level about the drivers of performance.
Yeah, another point about the halo effect is just that because things worked at one point doesn't mean that those same things are going to work forever. In a previous interview I've heard you do, you've said, they've done those things well. Does that mean they're going to be successful forever? No, because the nature of competition is that companies that are high performers in one time period inevitably suffer a kind of regression. The nature of performance in a business setting is breaking out, falling back, and then having to reinvent. Very few companies can be successful over multiple generations. That's just the way it goes. And when I heard you say that, my immediate thought was that that's a perfect summation of Connie Mack and the Philadelphia Athletics. Not just in 1912, but I'm talking about they build this dynasty, they break it down, he builds another one, they break that down.
Yeah, I applaud you bringing in some of the business connections, but let's be a little bit careful here. In business, you can have changes in technology, you can have new entrants, you can have mergers. You don't easily have those things in baseball where you pretty much have a set format for the entire season. Mm-hmm. But yes, there is rising and falling, and baseball is a good example in the sense that At the end of the year, the total number of wins is the total number of losses, and you're going to revert back to an equilibrium status overall. We can't all be winners, okay?
Right.
And as you pointed out, there were some pretty bad teams that year. Now, we can have systems that over time become more in equilibrium, as Gould has shown with regard to, say, batting averages. But the iron law of the standings at the end of the year is the amount of wins is the amount of losses, and it's pretty hard to stay at the top for too long. Now, great exception to that, you look at the Yankees from the 20s and 30s really all the way until 1964, but you're looking at, for most of that, an 8-team league, and of those 8 teams, for most of those years, the Athletics were not a factor. The Senators were not a factor.
And the Yankees had 148 farm teams. So they're signing every great player in the country, and everybody grows up wanting to be a Yankee. So, like, they had a different path than some of their competition in those years.
Sure. And one could argue that the Kansas City Athletics were a bit of a farm team for
Absolutely.
them for a while. And you look at the
Absolutely.
number of players that they'd park a player there and bring him back and so forth. So there are ebbs and flows, although now we see, with sabermetrics and the way starting pitchers are being used, there are some changes. But by and large, the game has stayed the same. And you don't have a new entrant or a merger or this kind of thing. So we have to be a little bit careful how far we take the analogies. But in general, yeah.
So what's next on the horizon for you? Is there anything you're working on or anything you're looking forward to?
Just speaking of baseball, I'm not really an active collector at this point. I wanted for many years to do the annotated treatment of the T202 set, and I'm very pleased with the way it came out, but I don't think there's more collecting horizons. I'm not one of these people that needs to collect more. In fact, I'm kind of at a deacquisition stage of my life, and right now I'm thinking more, what am I going to do with my cards? Because, I have 2 kids, and neither is really that fond of baseball, and what am I going to do with all this stuff? But I still enjoy the game. There's things that the way the game has gone, the number of strikeouts, the whole launch angle home runs thing, there's some directions the game has gone that I'm not that happy with. And I'll give you one example. At the end of the 2014 season, one of these years, the Dodgers brought up September call-ups. And they brought up a guy that year who they put in center field, and he was a fleet-footed, good defensive player named Jock Peterson. And he was going to be the center fielder for the future. And I watched him. I thought, he's going to be great. This is going to be a guy who's going to hit 280, cover a lot of ground, and steal 30 bases. And the next year, he's in the home run derby, and he's hitting 210, and he's striking out, and he's going for the fences. And he's not dumb, and the Dodgers aren't dumb. And they must have said, that's what we want you to do. So I'm not blaming him. But I look at him, and I think a generation ago, he would have been a fleet-footed 280 hitter. And he would not have been strikeout, home run, strikeout, 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 home run.
Right.
So I'm not thrilled with the way the game has gone in that direction, which is why when I see a game where the fundamentals are executed really well, I'm thrilled with that. And in fact, if I can loop this back to the book, one of the captions about Hal Chase, great defensive first baseman for the New York Yankees, a left-hander, and he makes the statement, I think that one day a right-handed first baseman will be as rare as a left-handed catcher, because the 3-6-3 double play is easier and the sacrifice killing play is easier for a left-hander. Well, I had never heard that expression. What is a sacrifice killing play? Well, in those days, you had a lot more bunting, a lot more base-to-base inside baseball, a lot more sacrifice bunting, and a lot more of what he is describing. So here's the situation. Runner at second, batter hoping to bunt the runner to third. Today we would say, well, he's already in scoring position, why bother to do that? But there are times when you would like to bunt the runner over. If the first baseman charges and can pick up the ball and throw to third
In one motion.
you are killing the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because I thought sacrifice killing, that's redundant. A sacrifice is killing. No. We're not killing the batter who is sacrificing himself. We're killing his attempt to sacrifice the runner to third.
Yeah.
And so if a charging first baseman can scoop the ball and throw in one motion, you kill the sacrifice, and a left-hander can do that much better than a right-hander. Well, 2 nights ago, if I may say so, where we're recording this in October of 2025, and the Dodgers are playing the Phillies, and the Phillies have a rally going, and they've got a man at second, top of the ninth, and they want to bring him around. The batter is showing bunt, and the Dodgers figure out if he bunts to first, Freddie Freeman, you're a lefty, throw to third, Max Muncy will retreat to third base and take the throw. Mm-hmm. But if the bunt goes to third and Muncy charges, Mookie Betts, shortstop, you better cheat and get to third before, and that's what happened. So Mookie Betts is watching the runner on the pitch. He's running to third. Mm-hmm. The ball comes down to Muncy, who turns around, throws to Betts, tags him out. I just loved that.
Yeah.
And there are few examples of that. There was one that I found on YouTube. This was 1986, Keith Hernandez on the Mets. It was like the 14th inning of a game in Cincinnati, and the Reds were down to their last, and they've got a pitcher at bat, and he's going to bunt, and the Mets know that the batter is going to bunt. Mm-hmm. Hernandez charges, picks up the ball, and in one motion throws to third, cuts down the lead runner there. Sacrifice killing play.
Yeah, Hal Chase would have loved that play.
And you don't find very many,
yeah.
But that's how the game has evolved.
There's another thing about baseball today that Hal Chase would have absolutely loved, and that's all the betting.
He probably would have taken part in some of it. Oh, gosh, we better not go there. But to have ads for betting, I see ads for betting on the broadcast of a game. Mm-hmm. If you bet on this moment, this will happen. Here's your odds.
It makes it almost unwatchable for me.
Yeah, I'm not big on that.
Where can people buy this amazing book that you've written and really have a chance to delve into the physical copy of it as opposed to just scrolling through the liner notes as they listen to this episode?
Thanks for that. I have a website, and it's pmrbooks.com. Those are my initials, pmrbooks, all one word, .com. If you go to that website, you'll see other books I've written, including The Halo Effect and some other stuff I've done. But I really did this to make available the T202 book, which is called One Splendid Season. And so if you go to pmrbooks.com/T202, you will find a page there that has images from the book. It shows the layout. There's some endorsements from some great people who've said nice things about it. And there is a way to order there. If you just think, I'm going to go on Amazon, if you put One Splendid Season on Amazon, you will also find the book. Either way works. However the order is made, it goes to the fulfillment center I'm working with in Michigan. They will dispatch the book well packaged. And at this point, I just hope that people have an interest in baseball history, in the cultural side of baseball lore, as well as collectors may find this enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll throw links to your website and to the direct link on Amazon on the liner notes so people don't have to do any searching. If they're following along, just click right on it and order. How can people follow you on social media and stay up to date with what you're up to, or if they want to get in touch with you, if they've got possibly a 133rd T202 card that they want to tell you about? What's the best way for people to reach out?
Well, I'm not super active on social media. I do post some things on Instagram regarding the T202s, but on my site, there is a way to write to me if you want to. My email, in case anybody's interested, it's phil.rosenzweig@imd.com. That's still where I worked. They haven't kicked me off the email system yet, so PHIL. My last name is spelled ROSENZWEIG @imd.com if anybody wishes to write. But you can also do it, as I say, through the website. And if people have comments, if they find errors, which I don't think they will because I've gone through this ad nauseum to prove it, but if they have comments so here's a real request. If anybody says, I have an example of the original photograph used on this center panel and you're not showing it here and I have this available, I would love to see it. Not that I think there's going to be another edition. I don't think there will be at this point, but just in the interest of research to try to be as thorough as I can. Mm-hmm. Or if they can identify any of the photographers. We know a lot about Charles Conlon. We know Louis Van Ooyen. The man who I think was behind all the photographs in Athens, Georgia, was a man named Cy Seidman, who at that time was maybe 18 years old. But I think that was him. There are a couple photographs from Chicago that may be Francis Burke, but we don't know. Anyway, if anybody can add something to the historical account and the annotation of the T202 set, in that sense, it's always a work in progress. And if people find new things to add to the annotation, then that's very welcome.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up the photographers at this point, because I was going to say to end the interview, where we first met was at Paul Referson's exhibition with the Jackie Robinson and the Color Line. And I've had Paul on this podcast previously to talk all about baseball photography and specifically Charles Conlon and guys from this dead ball era. So the fact that that's where you and I met, just this kind of full circle moment to be sitting here with you. So thank you so much for your time. And it's been really cool getting to know you and diving into your book. It's something I've had my nose in for the past 6 weeks preparing for this interview. And it's just a really well done, well written, well researched book that is also visually beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul is one person that I met after the softback came out, when John McMurray, who's the chair of the Dead Ball Interest Group at SABR, published a little article about the book. And so Sean Brennan, Andrew Aaronstein, Paul Rieferson, and a few others, Jim Chapman, who has an extraordinary collection, 2 pictures of which I've copied with his permission and cited here, they came forward with various images. And so from the softback edition in 2021, which was done in a small quantity and not available for sale, to now the hardback version, which is in a larger quantity and available for sale, I think it took a major step forward, in large part because of people like Paul and Andrew and Jim and others who were so helpful. So it's thanks to them, and of course to Antonio, whose team was so helpful in the layout. So it's a team effort in that regard.
Cool. Well, thank you again for your time, and good luck with the next edition of the book.
Thank you. Thanks. Great to be here.
If you think this episode has been worth even $1, please click the donate button in the upper right corner of our website, shoelesspodcast.com. That is a direct link to my PayPal profile where you can make a donation in any amount. If you don't have PayPal and you want to send a donation through Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, or any other platform, shoot me an email at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com and I'll send you directions for whichever method you prefer. No amount is too small. It all adds up to allow us to keep creating this content for you year after year. And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom, who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
Yeah, apparently I'm the yin to your yang about how we inspect postcards. So, and in all fairness, I do look at the front of the card.
Yeah.
And it's not
45 minutes after you read the back. When I go, can you look at the front now, please? Because that's why I was showing you this postcard of Columbia Park that is super rare.
Yeah. But really, it's not just the words. Really, the first thing I'm looking at is the postmark for the date and the city, because that tells me where and when, what was going on when this card was being sent. To me, that's fascinating. That is why I like to do that, and I never realized it bothered you so much.
It doesn't bother me. It's just funny.
Apparently not.
No, for real, it doesn't. I mean, I know that you like to go to cemeteries, and that doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah.
We just have different interests.
Yeah.
I go.
Right,
It's
that's what I was
because
going to say.
I don't go to cemeteries without you, though, unless it's with Jacob.
Yeah.
No, it's just we have different ways of looking at things, and that's, I think, what makes this segment interesting, is that we share common interests, but look at them from different perspectives.
Right. We both get to the same place at the end, but we just might approach it a little bit differently. I don't know if you realize this, but when we were living in Hawthorne Woods for 25 years, and there was Lakewood Forest Preserve in Wakanda, Illinois, they had the Kurt Teich postcard archive. I know when they received that as a donation, I thought, oh, how fascinating would that be to be a volunteer, which they were seeking, to go and sort those and catalog them in whatever way they were going to do. Can you imagine having your hands on those different objects?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, you kind of collect postcards too. And like I said in the interview, I definitely collect old postcards, not just baseball stadium postcards. That's the majority of my collection. But when I moved to Cleveland, one of the first things I bought was an eBay auction for a lot of like 80 different postcards of historic buildings and locations in the city, because for me, that's a fun way to learn about the history of a city. And the postcards don't just show like old hotels or baseball stadiums, but they also show museums and usually a post office, parks and popular streets and cemeteries. And that always gives me a jumping off point for places to visit or places to research, because the postcards are telling you what the city itself thought was important about its own city. So luckily, a lot of those buildings are still standing and we're able to go visit them, which gives you an even greater appreciation for when you get there. And I think that's something that we have enjoyed doing, is seeing old buildings and then coming home and being like, yeah, and here it is on the postcard. Or going to the bridge that we went to, Nicholson Bridge, on the way to Cooperstown.
Right. So I grew up in Harvey, Illinois, and in our town, there was an Andrew Carnegie Library that was built in 1908, the year my grandfather was born. The building was fantastic. It was just, the architecture of that building was phenomenal and so interesting. And of course, they tore it down like in the 1970s and put up literally like a rectangle. But in my mind, I could always envision it. But you know how you get older and it's like, am I really remembering correctly? And then God created eBay and came across a postcard of the Andrew Carnegie Library, of which there's a whole series from around the country of Andrew Carnegie libraries. And it was like, thank you. It was as amazing and intricate and ornamental as I remembered. And now I own a card of that. And right, different parts of the civic community that would form big little cities. Back in the day, Harvey was a big little city. It's not anything like that now. But when you look at, like you said, City Hall, Oddfellows Hall was a thing, the post offices, those were big civic buildings and ornamental in their own respect. When they had stereoscopes back at the turn of the century, the 1800s going into the 1900s, you had an image that would slip into the top of the stereoscope, and it was a side-by-side image that when you look through the two viewers, your eyes and brain put that together into one 3D image. That same type of image is what they use for the postcards that you and I both now like to collect. Those really capture a moment in time, just like when Phil was talking about something that really intrigued him and was a rabbit hole he went down, was looking at the vocabulary and the verbiage used in the captions, looking at it and analyzing it, because words and terms weren't invented yet, weren't adopted yet. You know, it seems quaint the way they refer to different things, but that is how it was, and it matches with the images.
Yeah, one of the more interesting pieces that I have in my collection that's not valuable in any way, but it's just a little clipping from a newspaper from the dead ball era that talks about different players' injuries and why they were on the injured list. And the reasons themselves were wild, but then like the phrasing behind them, reasons like consumption or tuberculosis or
diphtheria.
Like, yeah, or like ptomaine poisoning, which is food poisoning. That's what they called it in the 1910s. Like you mentioned, the vocabulary behind these things or just the concepts. I don't think you'd see somebody go on the injured list for food poisoning necessarily today. But
right.
You'd maybe miss a game or two, but I don't think you're going on like a 15-day DL. But if you've got typhoid fever, you might.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Well, look at Christy Mathewson.
Yeah. Okay, all that being said, what did you think of the Phil Rosenzweig interview?
I so want to talk about the book, and we will, but there's one part where you were talking about his childhood and how he even got involved in becoming a baseball fan. Everyone's origin story. Whoever listens to this podcast, you know you all have your origin stories. When you asked him, was he already savvy enough in 1962 to realize his heart was broken when they lost the 1962 World Series? He said what he remembers at that time was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That blew me away. Yeah. I had to think, okay, he's the same age as my brother. I wasn't in school yet, but think how impactful that was to him, that memory overrode his heroes on the field. When you know about what was going on with the Cuban Missile Crisis and what was going on in school classrooms at that point, it was kids going under their desk for protection from the nuclear missiles. That just really struck a chord with me.
One of my earliest memories in school, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, when computer labs were like being introduced into schools, and as a first or second grader, like they're bringing your class in to teach you, this is how you use a computer, this is how you do research. They were like, children, you can pick whatever topic you want, write a research paper on your topic. And so everybody's picking like elephants. And I picked the Cuban trade embargo because you had been telling me about the Cuban Missile Crisis because we're Kennedy people.
Right.
And so I had
That's
done...
my boy.
And
Tell me how I'm your mom.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the computer teacher was like, now, how do you know what that is? And are you sure you don't want to do your research paper on like giraffes? And I was like, no, I got it.
Oh, I'm so proud right now.
Yeah.
I can't tell you.
For real, that's one of the reasons why I've wanted to go to Cuba for forever, is from learning about the Cuban Missile Crisis through you.
Yeah.
Also, very early on in the episode, Phil talked about his dad taking 25 cents a week from his allowance to pay for the Topps complete set of baseball cards. Did you get an allowance when you were a kid?
I remember that topic would come up as a motivator and, okay, from now on, you're going to have to do this. And it would last for about 3 weeks and it was over. But I was trying to do the math of how long
many weeks it would take to pay off $14.95.
Right, exactly.
60.
I wrote down $14.95. His dad drove a hard bargain.
If you would have gotten a consistent allowance, what would you have spent your money on?
Oh, Tiger Beat magazine for sure. Or Archie comic books.
Really?
Absolutely. I would buy them daily.
With what money?
Money from my mom's wallet.
Oh. So you got an allowance. She just didn't know you were getting it from.
So my dad worked nights. So during the day, he was home when I came home from school. But we had like a little convenience store in between school and my house. And they sold all that kind of stuff, the Archie comic books and everything. I would stop very often. And this is probably like third grade, fourth grade, but grade school. And I'd get a pack of Suzy Q's. And if a new issue of an Archie comic book came out, I picked that up. And then when I got to be older, like 7th and 8th grade, then would start picking up 16 magazine. And actually 16 magazine I liked better than Tiger Beat.
That's funny.
All right, now we have to go to the book. You had mentioned prefacing some of the topics about what a beautiful book this was. So fair warning to our listeners, when you buy this book, open it only when you have a few hours of time to sit down and look through it, because you are not going to want to put it down and you are going to read through that whole thing.
Though I will say it was an easy book to just read a page or two at a time.
It was, but for me, this book is in my sweet spot in terms of the era.
Yeah, same.
You both alluded to it during your conversation, the way it was formatted to show the actual photograph that would be the source for the end panels, but then also the center photographs as well. But to see the original photographs of the end panels, first of all, you and I are both huge photography fans of that era. Conlon, love them. And so immediately when I opened up, that's what I was seeing. But to see the drawn image juxtaposed to the original photograph, I was struck immediately by how authentic and how accurate the drawing was compared to the actual photograph. And that really surprised me. It was by no means a caricature.
Right.
Not at all. Even I'll say worry lines in a forehead or crow's feet at the eyes, they captured it all. And it wasn't exaggerated. It was like, I don't know how much of my time I just spent staring and analyzing that.
Though some cards, like I believe the Eddie Grant card that I think Phil brought up in this interview, he had a ton of freckles. And so in his actual photograph, they're front and center. I mean, it's clear as day. It's a super close-up photo. And in the illustration, they get rid of his freckles. So not every single one is a perfect representation. But yes, I love that about the T205 set and about this set, that this is the first time you ever see these people in color.
Right.
Right.
That goes to the next subject, which is what is the preference for having it be a drawn image versus the actual photograph? And you talked about that as well. I really think it's a thing of preference. I would like it to be all black and white, but that's my personal preference. But I could see how the color adds the pop. It's very attractive and nice to look at and all that. Can't we just do another set that's just all black and white?
Yeah, I think the Library of Congress has high-resolution photos of a bunch of these images.
His insights after doing so much research, but also just the hours of study that he must have spent. Something that it was great hearing this side of it is, where was the placement of the photographer when those photographs were taken for the center panel shots? And as soon as he said, well, they'd either be at first base, and then I'm like, or third, and then there's the Ty Cobb iconic shot. It just clicked of, that makes total sense. And then why you wouldn't have an outfield shot or a second base shot unless it was at a certain distance or whatever.
Yeah, the anecdote about Phil learning that some of the photos used as the center panels were taken during spring training in Athens, Georgia was really interesting to me. And that made me think back to some photos of Shoeless Joe Jackson that I've come across over the years. Because for some seasons, the Cleveland Naps had their spring training in Athens, Georgia. And there are pictures of Joe and some of his teammates both on the field in Athens and within the town too, and like interacting with people who lived in Athens or were with the team on the trip. And it was cool to know that there are photos from that spring training site where Joe played, which also appear in this card set. So to have the documentation and kind of like triangulate all of these stories that I've been reading about for decades is like, oh, this is cool.
Yeah, when that light bulb goes off and you have the validation of another piece to the puzzle of placing someone in that spot.
Mm-hmm.
It was also interesting how they distinguished between the American League and the National League.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the National League was more impressive because you really were seeing the player, and that's really what I would want to see. So I wonder, did the designers of the cards have an in with the National League or what? Like how?
Well, that decision had already been made the year before with the T205 set. Because the Hassan card set, the T202s, came out in 1912 when the T205 set came out the year before. So the Hassan set just straight up used the panels that T205 had already created.
Okay, so then I'll push it back.
Yeah.
Who drove that? Because obviously you're pointing out your stars. You're giving it more star quality to focus on the person rather than the ornate detail around that person.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. It would be interesting to learn.
Phil talked about how the Spalding Guide was a key source for this series and other card images as well. And so you pulled out something from your library, which was a more modern cover, but an original interior of a Spalding Guide, and just flipping through, and you immediately see the connection there. It's clear as day. Kind of nice to have an artifact to help us along understand exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I love having so much random stuff that basically no matter who we're talking to or what we're talking about, I can always pull out something that's like, this is what we're talking about.
I am your mom. I can attest that you have tons of random stuff. And it's really cool.
But Phil talked about that too, like the ability to add context to the images with the captions that he writes in the book and how those give a jumping off point to the reader to do further research if they want to on a particular topic. And I know exactly what he's talking about and how he feels because that is precisely what the goal is with the liner notes that we do on the website that accompany every episode of this podcast. Because sometimes you just can't explain every single thing in the moment, or the conversation goes in such a way that by the time somebody's done making their point, it doesn't make sense for me to be like, okay, remember that thing we were talking about 90 seconds ago? Here's the full story behind that, because it would just derail the momentum. That's why I add the links in the captions of all the photos and videos in the liner notes, because I want the full context sometimes.
Right.
And it's funny because, you know, I post these on this day in baseball history graphics every single day, and I'll post them on Reddit and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, like it's everywhere. But particularly on Reddit, where lots of people interact in the comments, so often people will be like, you forgot to mention this. And it's like, brother, I had 4 sentences to talk about a thing that's like a year-long story.
Right.
But that's the point of these posts, is to start the conversation. And I get comments all the time of people being like, I had no idea that this even was a thing that happened. And after reading your post, I went to Wikipedia and learned all about it. Like, this is so interesting. It's like, that is the point.
Right.
I'm not going to be able to tell you the full story in 4 sentences. But I want to get the point across that if this interests you, now you can go. And that's why at the bottom of all my posts, I put the sources. Like, here's where I got my information from. Here's where you can go. And it is fun to watch people be like, I did that and I loved it.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I read that and I'm surprised. And sometimes I'll jump in and say that. And it could be something about a Chicago team that I thought I know, I know a thing or two. But it's like, really? That happened?
Right.
How about that? As an art person, I have to just say that the look of the T202s immediately made me think of triptychs, and I thought it was really interesting because you also talked about the cathedrals of baseball were being built at the same time that this series came out. To me, it's not a far stretch that you have the cathedrals, that term being used for these stadiums, and then you have these triptychs come out for the saints and the heroes on the field of these cathedrals. The way triptychs came about centuries ago, the ones that I'm most familiar with have a religious basis. And before the general populace of the world was literate the way, I'll just say for the Catholic Church, I know this, That's how they got to stained glass, because they would tell the stories with the images. People didn't have to read. They could look at it. And that's the same purpose that a holy card or a triptych would do. And I own some triptychs that are of this era, and they are just really fascinating. But it is so similar. It seems like one is taken off the other.
Well, even the way that triptychs are laid out, where the center panel is the action,
Right.
and the left and right panels are like kind of close-ups of individual people. That's not always how it works, but oftentimes like that is the breakdown, where the left and right panels have a focus on a more specific figure.
Right. The energy and the focus is definitely the center panel. You might have angels or something else going on the sides as decoration even. But right, it's all in support of the same theme, but that center shot is the one, somebody's getting something done to them generally.
Right.
It's not pretty a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But that's part of the message as well, so I'm talking about the religious ones now, not
Yeah,
the
yeah.
baseball ones.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have we gone to art museums in every city of the country? Whenever we travel, that's something we will try to do. I mean, we've seen these triptychs in person, and to read the book and hold the T202 cards in your hands, I've got a couple in my collection. Like, to me, there's no denying that there's influence drawn from those in some form or fashion.
And again, to me, that says what period of American history you're in as well, because the country was generally a little bit more religious in that way. Like those were things of the time. So yeah, for me, putting the word cathedral together with that, it was a nice meld.
Yeah, there's even a baseball book called Green Cathedrals about baseball stadiums. So yeah, that is an appropriate term for what we're talking about here.
Right. I just want to go to the photography one more time. Phil was talking about Caught Asleep at First. We had the book here when I was listening to the episode, so immediately I opened it and got right to that shot, and you see the ball suspended in air. And even though in modern baseball photography you do see things isolated like that, to see it in that black and white image and it's just hanging there, it's so cool. And in the stance of a lot of the players or umpires or the people within these images in the book, it is reminiscent to me of the Wright brothers photographs, like when they're at Kitty Hawk or whatever. When I saw one of these, I thought, whatever brother stood on the ground and watched the other guy go up, like, oh no, you go. The one on the ground, his positioning of his body is like, he looked like he was an umpire, like getting ready to make the call. So that was a thing of the time, but that ball suspended, really cool thing to capture.
It blows my mind that this card set is 110 years old, more than that.
Right. It is mind-blowing.
To think of how ahead of its time it was conceptually and with the actual print technology, and I'll talk more about that in the next segment. But I brought this up in the interview with Phil that it wouldn't be for 50 more years that a baseball card set had action photography as the basis of base cards in the set.
And I don't understand that, because you think at the time these are being produced, there's no TV, there's newspapers, but I don't know how many inches a newspaper would give to baseball images. So if you're trying to build your sport and draw fans, why wouldn't you have these images? Why was it not until 50 years later or whatever?
Based on the comment that Phil made about the National League president saying no photos during games, I don't think it was the goal necessarily to grow the game. Or maybe they didn't understand how to do it.
But I think he made a good point about maybe the president felt the photographers might be impeding the progress of the play on the field. And I'm like, okay, I can get that. All right, but then the American League guy can say, fine, you do you, but you know what? This is going to sell. I mean, the whole point of this is to sell. You're selling something. You're either selling tobacco or you're selling tickets to the game. It just blew me away when you said that. It took 5 decades.
But we saw that in the 60s, 70s, 80s as Chicago Blackhawks fans. They're not putting the games on TV.
Right.
Not everybody understands how to market a product, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, you know what I had to say about when that happened.
Right.
So. It's illogical. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. When you look back at some of the decisions that were made, it's just surprising. I love the distaste in Phil's voice when he said the word dismembered. Like it was a personal affront that someone would rip that card, not even cut it, but rip it to get to the one part that they wanted. He was very much offended by that. And I don't blame him, but you definitely heard it in his voice.
Oh, yeah.
He could handle a lot of things, but that's a line too far. And he actually used the word, it's abhorrent to him.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've had someone say abhorrent in all the 10 episodes we've done, but he scored on that one.
Yeah. In the first episode of this season, I asked you what you wanted to talk about and who you wanted to talk about and learn about this year. And one of your answers was Tris Speaker. How did you feel learning about him calling for the ball during the last game of the World Series? A pop-up to the other team. He's like, you got it, you take it. You fools.
I didn't say he was a clean player.
And that
Tris
won them the
Speaker
World Series.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
He was not a saint.
To say the least.
Yeah, in that cathedral, he was not a saint.
Yeah.
But my fascination with Tris Speaker, it's not so much his play on the field or what he did with gambling. That's not it. My fascination with Tris Speaker is the team leader he was with the Ray Chapman episode. And as soon as I think of him carry Ray Chapman off that field into the dugout and off the field, that told me everything I needed to know. And then, they go through a 2-week depression, of course, but then he gets that team to turn around and they win the World Series.
Yeah.
That is why I'm Team Tris.
Yeah. Okay. I think this was fun. How did you feel about it?
It was. Well, I love the book.
Yeah.
This book resonates with me because of the photographs, not because of the images, because I can look at a book on the T206 set. It doesn't do anything for me. It's interesting and I get it and I can appreciate it, but it doesn't do anything for me. The images of seeing the actual photographs, that's what's meaningful to me. And that's why this book mattered.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, including daily posts detailing an important event which happened on this day in baseball history. You'll also be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. If you're a fan of some more long-form posts, you can sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. We'll also have giveaway contests that are exclusively for our newsletter subscribers, giving you even more chances to win some cool stuff. Look for a new issue to be published on the 2nd Friday and the 4th Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. Before the interview with Phil, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something. Here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter or Blue Sky at Shoeless Podcast. Then, find the pinned post at the top of our profile with the link to the Phil Rosenzweig episode, which asks this episode's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in this episode you just finished listening to. Quote that post along with your answer, and you'll automatically be entered. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win a copy of Phil's book, One Splendid Season, Baseball in America in 1912, told with the words and images of the Hassan Triplefolder set. We'll announce the winner before the next episode of the podcast goes live. You don't have to be the first person to answer, you just have to answer correctly. But make sure you're actually following us on your preferred social media platform, or your entry won't be counted. We also do a separate giveaway related to every episode through our email newsletter, and the winner of that contest gets a different prize. So make sure you're signed up for Clearing the Bases, and you'll have a chance to win something else this month too. During the previous segment, we mentioned how We touched on the idea of triptychs, but I wanted to flesh out some of those thoughts a bit more with some added context. Triptychs grew out of the hinged diptychs, which were used in Byzantine and medieval art, but they blossomed in the 15th and 16th centuries. The fact that they were 3 panels naturally evoked the Holy Trinity of Christian symbolism of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The central panel is also the largest and most detailed, and, in religious triptychs especially, usually holds the key sacred scene, showing the Virgin and Child, the crucifixion, or another central mystery. The side panels which flank that central panel contain subsidiary narratives, possibly saints who are important to the patron or local community, narrative episodes leading into or flowing out of the central mystery, or donor portraits, kneeling in prayer, presented by their patron saints. Wealthy merchant families and guilds commissioned triptychs as statements of piety and social standing. Their own likenesses, often kneeling in the wings, made devotion visible and tied their salvation to their civic identity. Some triptychs were large immovable altarpieces, like the Ghent altarpiece, but others were small folding objects meant to be carried with you for private devotion, a fusion of art and practical spiritual technology. The size of the cards allowed followers of all ages the ability to worship their idols wherever they wanted, since the small triptychs could be in their pockets with them at all times. Now we know, with certainty, that at least some of the people associated with the photography and design of baseball cards from the early 1900s were absolutely aware of European art history and procedures. Carl J. Horner was a studio photographer based in Boston who was recognized by Sporting Life in 1903 as the quote-unquote official photographer of the major leagues. But Horner wasn't born in Boston. He was born in Sweden, and even purposely advertised himself as a, quote, European photographer, to indicate that he was artistic in a way in which American photographers were not. Horner's portraits appeared in prominent baseball annuals like Spalding's Official Baseball Guide and Reach's Official American League Baseball Guide. He regularly photographed major leaguers until 1909, including established veterans and rising stars, and even some obscure players who would have brief careers. His use of light in his studio was extremely reminiscent of the lighting used in the portraits that classic European painters used. Now, I'm not saying that Horner designed the baseball cards that his photographs appeared on, or even that he influenced the design, but he was clearly familiar with European art, and it is not far-fetched to imagine that other people who were responsible for designing cards were familiar with it as well, possibly even drawing inspiration for the cards they were designing from some of the pieces they had seen. Each triple folder in the T202 set unfolds like a miniature altarpiece, a triptych lifted straight from the visual language of churches and medieval devotion. At a time when baseball was taking root as America's civic religion, the design on these cards echoed a form used for centuries to honor holy figures. While the manufacturers most likely chose the layout for practical reasons, you could just fit in more pictures by folding the cards neatly into a cigarette package, the effect is unmistakable, a devotional object celebrating the idols of the diamond. In the central panel, an action scene plays out, almost a miracle in progress, while the side panels present upright portraits, each framed like an icon. The structure invites you to open it, to linger over it, and to take in the player with something approaching ritual attention. This aesthetic connects beautifully with the themes found in The Celebrant, a novel by Eric Rolf Greenberg, where fans elevate Christy Mathewson to near mythic status, treating him as a kind of secular Christ whose grace transcends the ordinary game. Even the novel's title, The Celebrant, carries double meaning, a devout fan, but also the person who performs a rite, like a priest presiding at the Eucharist. The Hassan Triplefolders function the same way. They transform players into figures of quiet veneration, with the triptych format encouraging contemplation and a form of admiration that borders on devotion. When it comes to the process of physically producing these cards, there are some interesting stories behind that too. By the 1910s, lithographers weren't limited to hand-drawn stonework like they had been in years past. In fact, the T206 cards, and possibly also the T205s, were created using a multi-layered lithographic printing process, which involved transferring images from stone or metal plates to paper. Those stones would have been huge slabs of specially prepared limestone, usually 2 to 4 inches thick. According to researcher Steve Birmingham, there is a bit of evidence that a 2-color press may have also been used for the T206 set. It's possible that a press that printed from a roll of cardstock rather than from individual sheets was used for some, and that probably would have been metal plates instead of the limestone. This technique allowed for the vivid, detailed portraits that define the set, but it also introduced challenges. Each card required multiple layers of ink, one for each color, So if the plates were misaligned, it resulted in off-register cards, where colors overlapped incorrectly or left gaps in the design. The American Lithographic Building, which is potentially one of the buildings where T206 cards were printed, still stands in New York City at the corner of 19th Street and 5th Avenue. One of the most intriguing aspects of T206 cards is the variety of plate shifts and color inconsistencies. A slight movement of the printing plate during production could cause misaligned borders or skewed portraits. These miscut cards are highly sought after by some collectors as they offer a glimpse into the challenges faced by early printers. As we learned from the Anvil Card Company, color variations were another byproduct of the printing process. Differences in ink quality, humidity, and plate wear meant that even cards from the same production run could have subtle differences in hue. For example, Ty Cobb cards might feature a brighter green background in one batch and a darker, muted tone in another. By 1912, printers could combine multicolor chromolithography, like the portraits seen in the T206 set, with halftone screens on the same lithographic plates. This meant a printer could render the side portraits in rich, layered colors and then drop in a black and white photographic panel in the middle, all in one pass, through the same lithographic process. But the whole thing was one integrated sheet, folded and cut. Collectors of the T202 set often describe the center as photographic, while the sides are litho art, which makes it sound like two different printing processes that have been spliced together. But in reality, it was all lithography. The distinction is in how the image was prepared for the lithographic plate. The end panels reused the same portrait artwork and plates from the T205 era, which we mentioned throughout the episode. Those were hand-drawn separations which were printed in multicolor chromolithography. But the center panels were created from an actual photograph, converted into a halftone screen, and then transferred onto a litho plate. It looks different because it's tonal, not drawn, but it's still lithography, just photolitho instead of hand-drawn chromo work. It's one process, but two input styles, and yet another reason why this incredible card set was years ahead of its time. Don't forget, it's a huge help when you rate and review My Baseball History wherever you listen to the podcast. 5-star ratings help our show get featured on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means more people will have a chance to discover it. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends or family is great too. Feel free to send this episode to anyone in your life who loves baseball or collects baseball cards. Hopefully they'll enjoy it and maybe they'll even learn a thing or two. But no matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.